Hey guys, tonight we're taking a journey back in time, stripping away your smart devices, your climate control, your perfectly filtered water, and your Uber Eats. Imagine yourself standing on a dusty, windswept plain, the sun beating down mercilessly, or perhaps the biting wind whipping through thin clothes, the scent of wood smoke, horses, and unwashed bodies hangs heavy in the air. A stark contrast to your freshly laundered sheets. You hear the creak of wagon wheels, the distant crack of a whip, and the occasional sharp report of a gunshot, not from a movie, but from real life, happening just around the bend. Your modern sensibilities, your dependence on instant gratification, your very immune system, would likely crumble under the sheer weight of what it took just to survive. You probably won't survive this, not a single day. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You open your eyes, not to your cozy bedroom, but to a rough canvas tent. The air thick with the smell of damp earth and stale coffee. Your pillow is a rolled-up horse blanket, and the ground beneath you is lumpy and unforgiving. The first rays of dawn pierce the flimsy fabric. But they don't bring warmth, they just highlight the dust motes dancing in the cold morning air. You shiver, pulling the scratchy blanket tighter around you. There's no thermostat here, no gentle hum of central heating to ward off the chill. Your body, accustomed to regulated temperatures, rebels almost instantly. You feel a prickle of unease, a gnawing discomfort that modern life has largely eradicated, as you crawl out, stretching muscles you didn't know could ache so much from just sleeping. You notice the sounds. No distant traffic, no sirens. Instead, the snorts and whickers of horses tethered nearby, the distant lowing of cattle, and the murmur of hushed voices from other tents. The world feels immense, untamed, and utterly indifferent to your presence. Your stomach rumbles, a familiar sensation. But there's no kitchen, no refrigerator stocked with convenient options. You're acutely aware of your vulnerability, a sensation most of us rarely experience beyond a fleeting thought. This isn't a theme park, this is real, raw existence, where every decision, every comfort, every necessity is earned through grueling effort or simply goes without. Think about your morning routine. A hot shower, maybe some freshly brewed coffee, a quick check of your phone for the news. Now, strip all that away. Your shower might be a brief splash from a communal bucket, if you're lucky, and often it's just a dust bath. Coffee, if there's any. It's probably bitter, cooked over an open fire, and shared from a blackened tin cup. News. The only news you'll get is what you see with your own eyes, or what's shouted across the camp. Historians still argue whether the extreme sensory deprivation of modern comforts contributed more to the mental fortitude or the quiet desperation of frontier settlers. The sheer physical discomfort was just the beginning. The frontier wasn't just tough, it was fundamentally different. Your modern body, used to soft surfaces and predictable environments, would immediately protest. Your feet, accustomed to cushioned shoes, would blister and ache from walking on uneven, rocky terrain in stiff leather boots, or worse, no proper footwear at all. Your hands, used to keyboards and smooth surfaces, would quickly become calloused, cut, and scraped from manual labor you've never even considered. You'd find yourself constantly swatting at flies, battling mosquitoes, and picking burrs from your clothes. And forget about clean clothes. Laundry day was an event, not a routine, and often involved scrubbing garments against rocks in a frigid stream. It wasn't just inconvenient, it was an energy-draining chore that took away from other vital tasks like gathering food or repairing equipment. One mainstream historical fact to grasp is that the average lifespan on the frontier was significantly shorter than what we experience today, often by decades. A quirky tidbit, some frontier towns actually had designated spitting zones to try and curb the widespread habit of tobacco spitting, which was a major public health hazard. Not that it worked very well. Imagine that delightful aspect of daily life. The air itself was different, filled with dust, smoke, and the unwashed scent of humanity and livestock. Your lungs, used to relatively clean, filtered air, would be constantly irritated. Every breath would be a reminder of the raw, untamed world around you. This isn't just about surviving, it's about enduring, day after day, week after week, with no end in sight. The romance of the Wild West fades pretty quickly when you realize you're covered in grime, hungry, thirsty, and unsure if you'll see tomorrow. As your eyes adjust to the dim light filtering through the canvas, your immediate thought turns to the most fundamental of human needs: water. You probably woke up and, without a second thought, walked to your kitchen sink, turned a handle, and watched a stream of clear, potable water gush forth. Maybe you even grabbed a filtered bottle from the fridge. In the Wild West, that scenario is pure fantasy. Here, water isn't a given, it's a constant, life or death quest. And your modern expectation of abundant, clean hydration would get you killed faster than a rattlesnake bite. Imagine the metallic taste in your mouth, a dry, scratchy sensation that signals the onset of dehydration. You've been trekking for what feels like an eternity. The sun, a relentless anvil pounding on your skull. Your canteen, if you even have one, is bone dry. You scan the horizon, desperate for any sign of a shimmering oasis, a trickling stream, anything, but there's nothing but endless, parched landscape. This isn't just thirst, it's a deep, existential craving that twists your gut and makes your head pound. Your very thoughts become consumed by the single, overwhelming desire for liquid. When you do find water, it's rarely the pristine, clear liquid you're accustomed to. More often than not, it's a muddy puddle, a stagnant pond where cattle have wallowed, or a shallow, alkali-laden creek that tastes like bitter chemicals and promises a host of intestinal discomforts. You look at the cloudy, murky surface, perhaps with a few insects floating on top, and you have a choice: drink it and risk debilitating illness, or don't drink and face certain death by dehydration. Your germ-aware brain screams in protest, but your body, pushed to its limits, overrides the caution. You cup your hands, or perhaps use a tin cup if you're fortunate enough to possess one, and gulp down the tepid, gritty liquid, trying not to think about what microscopic horrors might be swimming within. Historians still argue whether early settlers truly understood the link between contaminated water and disease, or if they just attributed illnesses to bad air or divine displeasure. While some knew boiling helped, the practice wasn't widespread or always feasible. Your modern understanding of bacteria and viruses, your knowledge of giardia and dysentery, would be a useless burden here, because even knowing the risks, you'd often have no other option. A quirky tidbit: some desperate prospectors and travelers would try to distill water by digging a hole, placing a collection container in it, covering it with plastic if they had it, which they wouldn't. But imagine the thought process, and waiting for condensation. Or, more realistically for the period, they might use a canvas water bag which, while not filtering, would allow for some evaporative cooling. But even that was a luxury. The quest for water also dictated routes and settlements. Towns didn't just spring up anywhere, they were strategically located near rivers, natural springs, or established wells. Wagon trains followed routes known for their water sources, and missing one could spell disaster for the entire company. You might spend days digging a shallow well, only to find the water too salty to drink, or discover it's contaminated with minerals that cause excruciating cramps. There's no emergency services to call, no search and rescue teams, just you, the vast, silent land, and the relentless sun. Sometimes, the only available water was brackish, meaning it was a mix of fresh and salt water, or contained high levels of dissolved minerals. Drinking too much of this would ironically accelerate dehydration, pulling more water from your cells to try and flush out the excess salts. You'd feel perpetually bloated yet still agonizingly thirsty, a cruel trick of nature. This wasn't just an inconvenience, it was a constant, low-level dread. Knowing that every gulp could be a gamble, imagine knowing that the very thing you need to survive could also be the thing that slowly poisons you. It's a level of daily risk that your cushioned and comfortable life has utterly erased. Just thinking about it probably makes your mouth feel a little dry, doesn't it? With the parched agony of thirst momentarily, if imperfectly, slaked. Your next primal urge screams for food, your modern pantry, overflowing with an astounding variety of processed snacks, fresh produce, and gourmet ingredients, is a universe away from the stark reality of frontier sustenance. You're used to choice, to flavor, to nutrient labels. Here, your diet would be dictated by one simple, brutal fact: what you could find, kill, or trade for. And usually, it wasn't much. Imagine waking up, stomach growling, to the distinct aroma of, well, nothing particularly appealing. Your breakfast isn't a bowl of cereal or a smoothie. It's likely a hunk of dried, heavily salted meat, if you're lucky, or a spoonful of lukewarm, gritty cornmeal mush. There are no fresh eggs unless you just robbed a chicken coop, and certainly no artisanal toast. This isn't about enjoying your meal, it's about putting enough calories into your body to keep moving. The sheer monotony would be enough to drive a modern food enthusiast to madness day after day. It's often the same bland, tough, and often unappetizing fare. The staple diet of a typical frontiersman was heavy on preserved meats like jerky and salted pork. Hardtack, a brutally hard to unleavened biscuit that could crack a tooth. And cornmeal. Vegetables were a luxury, often only available seasonally if you managed to grow them, or if you were near a settlement that had a meager garden. Forget about your daily 5 servings of fruits and vegetables. Scurvy, a debilitating disease caused by vitamin C deficiency, was a very real and present danger. Your body, accustomed to a rich array of vitamins and minerals, would quickly begin to protest, leaving you feeling lethargic, weak, and susceptible to every passing illness. A mainstream historical fact: large-scale cattle ranching didn't truly take off until after the Civil War, so early settlers often relied on hunting wild game like buffalo, deer, or rabbit. But hunting wasn't a leisure activity, it was a demanding, time-consuming necessity, and success was never guaranteed. Missing a shot meant going hungry, or at least hungrier, and once you killed an animal, preserving the meat without refrigeration was another monumental task, usually involving salting, drying, or smoking. A quirky tidbit: some desperate frontiersmen would even try to eat prairie dog or rattlesnake if food was scarce enough. Imagine trying to make that palatable after a long day's work. Your culinary skills, probably limited to microwaving leftovers or following a recipe from a cookbook, would be entirely useless here. You'd quickly learn how to skin a rabbit, gut a fish, or prepare tough cuts of meat over an open fire, without the benefit of a modern knife set or even a clean cutting board. Historians still argue whether the high protein and fat content of the frontier diet, coupled with the immense physical exertion, truly provided adequate long-term nutrition, or if it simply delayed the inevitable onset of deficiency diseases. There was little understanding of balanced diets. You'd eat to survive, not for pleasure or health benefits. The concept of eating for fuel would take on a whole new, grim meaning. And let's not forget about the sheer lack of variety. Imagine eating dried beans for weeks on end, or gnawing on another piece of leathery jerky. Your taste buds, accustomed to a symphony of flavors, would be utterly bored, perhaps even revolted. The modern craving for sweet treats, for salty snacks, for anything beyond the basic, would go entirely unsatisfied. You'd learn to appreciate simple salt and pepper as exotic seasonings, if you even had them. The act of eating wouldn't be a social event or a moment of relaxation. It would be a hurried, often solitary, and always utilitarian task. Every calorie counted, every crumb was precious. Your psychological well-being, usually boosted by pleasant meal experiences, would suffer under this relentless, flavorless grind. Having grappled with the relentless demands of thirst and hunger, your mind, now perhaps dimly aware of its desperate physical state, would turn to the question of shelter. Forget your climate-controlled apartment, your solid brick house, or even your carefully pitched, waterproof tent with its built-in ground sheet and insect mesh. In the Wild West, shelter wasn't about comfort or even privacy, it was about basic survival. A thin barrier between you and the brutal indifference of the elements. Imagine trying to sleep under an open sky. Not a serene, starry night for stargazing, but a bone-chilling cold that seeps into your very bones, or a torrential downpour that quickly turns the ground into a muddy swamp. Your sleeping bag, with its modern insulation and cozy warmth, is a distant dream. Instead, you might have a thin, worn blanket, if anything at all, offering scant protection from the night's bite. Every rustle of leaves, every distant howl, every sudden gust of wind would heighten your sense of vulnerability. There's no sturdy roof over your head, no locked door to give you a false sense of security. For many, especially in the early days of westward expansion, shelter was often improvised and temporary, a lean-to made from branches and canvas, a dugout carved into a hillside, or simply huddling around a dwindling campfire. These weren't homes, they were desperate attempts to escape the worst of nature's wrath. Your body, accustomed to a soft mattress and a stable temperature, would quickly succumb to aches, stiffness, and the creeping dread of exposure. The simple act of finding a relatively dry, flat patch of ground for the night became a victory. A mainstream historical fact is that early sod houses, made from cutting blocks of prairie turf, were common on the treeless plains. These soddies were remarkably effective insulators, cool in summer and warm in winter, but they were also dark, damp, and often infested with insects and rodents. Imagine living in a dwelling where the roof literally grew grass, and sometimes leaked mud during heavy rains. Your aesthetic sensibilities, used to painted walls and clean lines, would be utterly horrified by the earthy, rough interiors. A quirky tidbit, some desperate homesteaders would resort to living in their overturned wagons for weeks or months while they struggled to build a more permanent structure. Think about that for a moment. Your entire home is a wooden box on wheels, exposed to every wind and critter. Historians still argue whether the psychological toll of such primitive living conditions contributed more to the widespread mental fatigue or the sheer resilience observed among frontier families. It wasn't just physical hardship, it was a constant reminder of your precarious existence. Building a proper cabin or log home was an immense undertaking, requiring back-breaking labor, specialized skills, and access to timber, which was often scarce. You'd be felling trees with basic axes, hauling logs, and fitting them together, all without power tools or even proper measuring instruments. Imagine trying to square a foundation with nothing but a rope and a good eye. Your modern DIY skills, probably limited to assembling IKEA furniture, would be profoundly inadequate, and even when a structure was built, it offered limited protection. Gaps between logs would let in drafts, insects, and even small animals. Windows might be nothing more than greased paper or a shutter, providing little light and no true insulation. The fireplace, while offering warmth, would also fill the small space with smoke, stinging your eyes and coating everything in soot. There was no such thing as a seal against the outside world. Every crevice was an invitation for the wild to creep in. Your concept of a safe space would be radically redefined, constantly challenged by the proximity of wilderness. The soft glow of your bedside lamp and the comforting silence of your insulated home would feel like an unattainable paradise. With the basic needs of water, food, and shelter barely met, you'd confront another relentless adversary in the Wild West: hygiene. Forget your daily hot showers, your scented soaps, your elaborate skincare routines, and your morning breath mints. In this era, cleanliness was a luxury rarely afforded and often impossible to maintain, leaving you in a constant, losing battle against pervasive dirt, grime, and the resulting stench. Your modern sensibilities, particularly your nose, would be in for a truly rude awakening. Imagine waking up, not to the fresh scent of fabric softener, but to the lingering odor of sweat, campfire smoke, and stale body odor that has permeated your clothes and skin. Your hair, once shiny and manageable, would be a greasy, matted mess, a perfect home for lice and other unpleasant companions. There's no running water for a shower, no heated bathroom, and certainly no array of toiletries. Your bath might consist of a quick, frigid dip in a creek, if one is even nearby, or more likely, just a vigorous dry brush-off, leaving a fine layer of dust clinging to everything. The concept of clean was simply far removed from our modern understanding. The lack of proper sanitation extended beyond personal hygiene. Outhouses were crude, often overflowing pits, or sometimes no designated spot at all, meaning human and animal waste was simply deposited near dwellings and water sources. This, combined with the lack of understanding about germ theory, created a breeding ground for diseases. Your immune system, accustomed to a relatively sterile environment, would be overwhelmed almost immediately. Just the sheer number of flies buzzing around, landing on everything from your food to your face, would be enough to make your skin crawl. A mainstream historical fact, widespread public health initiatives like sanitation systems and proper waste disposal didn't become common until much later in the 19th and early 20th centuries, on the frontier. Personal responsibility and luck were your only forms of public health. A quirky tidbit: some folks on the frontier actually believed that bathing too often was bad for you, thinking it opened up pores and made you more susceptible to illness. Imagine trying to convince someone to take a bath when they believed it would literally make them sick. Historians still argue whether this belief was a convenient rationalization for the difficulty of bathing or a genuine misunderstanding rooted in limited scientific knowledge. Your teeth, once meticulously brushed and flossed, would quickly accumulate plaque, cavities, and infections. There was no fluoride, no dentists readily available, and certainly no electric toothbrushes. A toothache, a minor inconvenience today, could quickly escalate into a life-threatening infection, spreading to your jaw or brain, and the smell. Imagine the cumulative aroma of unwashed bodies, stale sweat, rancid food, and animal waste. Your nose, so accustomed to air fresheners and pleasant scents, would be constantly assaulted by a symphony of truly offensive odors. Even doing laundry was an arduous task. It involved hauling water, heating it over a fire, scrubbing clothes by hand with harsh lye soap or even just plain dirt, and then laboriously drying them. This wasn't a weekly chore, it was an event, often done only when absolutely necessary, meaning most garments were worn for extended periods, accumulating layers of filth, the constant itching from sweat, dust, and potential parasites would be a persistent, maddening discomfort. You might find yourself scratching incessantly, oblivious to the fact that you're just spreading more grime. Your aversion to dirt and your need for personal space would be challenged beyond anything you could imagine. The very idea of smelling clean would be a forgotten memory, replaced by the ever-present pungent aroma of frontier life, even if you somehow managed to find enough water, scrounge up edible food, secure some form of flimsy shelter, and resigned yourself to a perpetually grubby existence. Your greatest threat in the Wild West wasn't a bandit or a stampede. It was something far more insidious, an invisible killer lurking in every drop of water, every bite of spoiled food, and every unwashed hand: disease. Your modern reliance on hospitals, antibiotics, and over-the-counter remedies would render you utterly helpless. Imagine a simple cough. Today, you might take some cough syrup, maybe a few days off work. In the Old West, that cough could quickly escalate into pneumonia, without any modern medical intervention beyond perhaps a poultice of herbs or a desperate prayer. Your lungs, already irritated by dust and smoke, would struggle, and within days, you might be gasping for breath. Your body racked with fever. There were no x-rays, no oxygen tanks, no intravenous fluids, just the terrifying reality of your own body failing, with virtually no hope of recovery. Common illnesses that we barely think twice about today were potent death sentences on the frontier. Diarrhea, often caused by contaminated water or food, could lead to rapid dehydration and death. Measles, mumps, and whooping cough, diseases largely eradicated by vaccines today, swept through communities, particularly devastating children. Your immune system, coddled by vaccinations and a relatively clean environment, would be unprepared for the onslaught of pathogens it would encounter daily. Every scratch, every cut, every insect bite carried the risk of infection, often leading to gangrene and amputation, or a slow, agonizing death from sepsis. A mainstream historical fact, epidemics of cholera, typhoid, and smallpox frequently decimated frontier towns and wagon trains. These were not isolated cases, they were widespread outbreaks that could wipe out a significant portion of a community in a matter of weeks. often with no understanding of their cause or how to stop them. A quirky tidbit: some frontier doctors believed that diseases were caused by bad humors in the body and would try to bleed patients using leeches or by cutting veins, hoping to draw out the illness. Imagine a doctor, instead of giving you penicillin, trying to attach leeches to your arm while you're already weak from fever. Historians still argue whether the widespread use of patent medicines, often containing alcohol, opium, or cocaine, provided any actual therapeutic benefit or simply dulled the patient's suffering while masking underlying conditions. The allure of quick cures was strong, but the reality was often dangerous. You'd likely be offered one of these concoctions, promising miraculous healing but delivering only temporary oblivion or further harm. There were no regulations, no scientific testing, just desperate hope and often cynical exploitation. Beyond acute illnesses, chronic conditions like tuberculosis were rampant, slowly wasting away individuals with no effective treatment. Childbirth was incredibly perilous for both mother and infant due to lack of sterile practices and skilled medical professionals. Injuries, from a broken bone to a deep gash, often resulted in permanent disability or death due to infection. Imagine breaking your leg miles from any settlement. Your only options might be a crude splint, excruciating pain, and the slow, creeping fear of gangrene setting in. The concept of pain management was rudimentary, usually involving alcohol or naturally occurring opiates. Every ache, every fever, every skin lesion would be a terrifying reminder of your extreme vulnerability. A constant dance with death that your modern mind simply isn't equipped to comprehend. Even if you somehow dodged the invisible bullet of disease, the Wild West had plenty of other ways to end your story, often involving the very creatures that called this untamed land home. Your familiar world of domesticated pets and animals safely behind fences would be shattered by the raw, unpredictable reality of wildlife encounters. Here, nature wasn't a scenic backdrop, it was a living, breathing, often hostile entity with teeth, claws, and venom. Imagine trudging through tall grass, the sun beating down, when suddenly you hear that distinctive, chilling rattle. A rattlesnake, coiled and ready, lies directly in your path. Your modern instinct might be to back away slowly, maybe call animal control. In this world, there is no animal control. Your options are to kill it before it strikes, or risk a bite that could mean days of excruciating pain, swelling, and almost certain death without antivenom. A luxury that simply didn't exist. Your heart pounds, sweat breaks out on your brow, and you realize how utterly unprepared you are for such a primal confrontation. This wasn't a casual stroll. Every step could bring you face to face with a creature that could end your journey then and there. Beyond snakes, the plains and mountains were teeming with larger, equally dangerous predators. Wolves hunted in packs, their hungry howls echoing through the night, a sound that would send shivers down your spine and make you pull your meager blanket tighter. Bears, especially grizzlies, were formidable adversaries, capable of tearing a human apart with terrifying speed and strength, particularly if you stumbled upon a cub or their food source. You wouldn't be admiring them from a distance through binoculars, you'd be trying desperately to avoid them, or defend yourself with whatever meager weapon you possessed. A mainstream historical fact: buffalo, American bison, while central to the lives of Native Americans, could also be incredibly dangerous to pioneers. A stampede could crush an entire wagon train, and even individual bulls, especially during mating season, were notoriously aggressive and unpredictable. Imagine a thundering herd, thousands strong, bearing down on your fragile wagon, the ground shaking beneath your feet. Your sense of scale, accustomed to relatively small animals, would be dwarfed by these immense beasts. A quirky tidbit: pioneers sometimes reported encounters with Gila monsters in the southwestern territories, venomous lizards whose bite, while rarely fatal to humans, could cause agonizing pain and severe swelling for days. Not exactly a fun souvenir from your travels, is it? Historians still argue whether the prevalence of animal attacks significantly deterred westward migration, or if the promise of land and riches simply outweighed the constant threat of nature's wild inhabitants. The psychological burden of constantly being on guard, knowing that any rustle in the bushes could mean danger, would be immense. Even smaller creatures posed significant threats. Swarms of mosquitoes and other biting insects, beyond being an irritating nuisance, carried diseases like malaria, which was rampant in many areas. Scorpions and spiders with venomous bites could inflict painful, debilitating injuries, often leading to fever and infection. You'd quickly learn to shake out your boots before putting them on and scrutinize every dark corner of your makeshift shelter. Your modern world is largely sanitized of such direct, existential threats from nature. We watch documentaries about apex predators from the comfort of our couches. In the Wild West, you were just another part of the food chain, and often not at the top. The constant awareness of these living, breathing dangers, the need to always be alert, to carry a weapon and know how to use it, would wear down your nerves. The rustle of leaves, the snap of a twig, the distant cry of an animal. These wouldn't be comforting sounds, they would be potential harbingers of doom. Your survival depended not just on your own strength, but on your ability to read the signs of the wild and react with lightning speed and deadly intent. Beyond the immediate threats of thirst, hunger, inadequate shelter, rampant disease, and dangerous wildlife, the Wild West presented another formidable and often inescapable adversary: weather extremes. Your climate-controlled life, with its readily available heating and air conditioning, has completely insulated you from the raw, unadulterated power of nature's mood swings. Here, the very air you breathed could become a killer. Imagine waking one morning not to a gentle breeze, but to a searing, dry heat that assaults you the moment you step outside your flimsy shelter. The sun, a malevolent eye in the sky, beats down relentlessly, baking the earth and shimmering off the distant horizon. This isn't just a warm day for the beach. This is a heat that steals your breath, saps your strength, and promises heat stroke and dehydration with terrifying efficiency. Your body, accustomed to sweating only during vigorous exercise, would be perpetually drenched, trying desperately to cool itself, while your water supply dwindles rapidly under the relentless evaporation. There's no cool drink, no shade trees for miles, just the oppressive, suffocating weight of the heat. Or perhaps it's the opposite extreme. One day, the air is crisp, and the next, a blizzard descends without warning, transforming the familiar landscape into a blinding, frigid wasteland. Snow piles up, drifts form, and the wind howls like a banshee, cutting through your thin clothing and chilling you to the bone. Your modern winter coat, designed for comfort and style, would be useless against the sheer, penetrating cold that threatens frostbite and hypothermia within hours. Every breath would sting your lungs, and the simple act of moving would become an agonizing struggle against deep snow and biting wind. You'd quickly realize that being cold today means wearing a light jacket. Being cold in the Wild West meant dying. A mainstream historical fact, the Great Plains, in particular, were notorious for their extreme temperature swings, from scorching summers that could hit well over 100 degrees to 38 degrees, to brutal winters dropping far below 0 degrees or 18 degrees, often with little warning or transition. A quirky tidbit: some desperate travelers caught in blizzards would resort to burrowing into snowdrifts for warmth, a technique used by animals, hoping the snow itself would provide insulation. Imagine burying yourself in snow just to survive the night. Historians still argue whether the psychological impact of constant exposure to these unpredictable and often deadly weather patterns contributed more to the stoicism or the fatalism of frontier settlers. Then there were the sudden, violent storms. Hailstones the size of walnuts could flatten crops and injure livestock, or even knock a person unconscious. Tornadoes, a terrifying sight even today with modern warning systems, would appear out of nowhere, tearing through settlements with devastating force, leaving a path of destruction and death. There were no storm shelters, no Doppler radar, no emergency alerts, just the darkening sky, the distant rumble of thunder, and the desperate scramble for any meager protection. Even phenomena like dust storms could be deadly, a massive wall of fine, choking dust, whipped up by strong winds, would sweep across the plains, turning day into night, stinging eyes, and filling lungs with abrasive particles. You'd be blinded, disoriented, and struggling for air, your throat raw and your vision obscured, hoping to avoid stumbling into a ravine or getting lost in the featureless grey. Your delicate respiratory system, accustomed to purified air, would protest violently, making every breath a painful effort. The sheer unpredictability of the weather, the constant threat of being caught unprepared, added another layer of unrelenting stress to daily life, making every journey a gamble and every season a test of endurance. So, you've battled thirst, hunger, inadequate shelter, disease, terrifying wildlife, and the caprice of extreme weather. But even if you survived nature's gauntlet, another pervasive threat loomed large in the Wild West, one that your modern society, with its intricate legal codes and pervasive law enforcement, has all but eradicated: lawlessness. Here, the rule of law was often absent, fragile, or enforced by individuals with questionable motives, meaning might often made right, and your personal safety was entirely your own responsibility. Imagine stumbling into a frontier saloon after a long, grueling journey. Your modern mind sees a place for a cold drink and some friendly conversation. In the Wild West, that saloon was a powder keg. A disagreement over a card game, a perceived insult, or even just a bad mood could escalate from harsh words to a draw of a pistol in seconds. There's no bouncer to intervene, no police officer on patrol, and certainly no court system for a petty dispute. The justice was immediate, brutal, and often fatal. Your instinct to de-escalate, to call for help, would be useless. You'd quickly learn that every interaction carried a subtle undercurrent of potential violence in many areas, particularly the truly remote frontier. Formal legal structures simply didn't exist or were too far away to be effective. There were no established police forces, no county sheriffs, no judges. What little law there was might come from a self-appointed town marshal, a vigilant group, or simply the consensus of the strongest individuals in a community. This created a chaotic environment where property rights were flimsy. Disputes were often settled by a gunfight, and violent criminals could operate with relative impunity. Moving from one ungoverned area to another, your concept of personal security, built on the assumption of societal order, would be shattered. A mainstream historical fact, legendary figures like Wyatt Earp and Bat Masterson gained their fame precisely because they attempted to bring some semblance of order to these chaotic frontier towns, often through the very violence they were trying to curb. A quirky tidbit: in some early mining camps, a claim jumper, someone who stole another's mining claim, might face summary execution by a miners' court, without anything resembling a modern trial or legal counsel. Imagine your property dispute ending with a noose. Historians still argue whether the prevalence of vigilante justice on the frontier was a necessary evil for establishing order in ungoverned territories, or if it simply perpetuated cycles of violence and injustice. The threat wasn't just from hardened outlaws. It could come from anyone: a disgruntled neighbor, a rival prospector, a drunken cowboy. Your life could be ended over a slight, a piece of land, or a misplaced glance. There was no 911 to call, no protective arm of the state. You were expected to defend yourself, your family, and your property. This meant carrying a weapon, knowing how to use it, and being prepared to use it at any moment. Your modern aversion to firearms and violence would be a significant liability, even when law enforcement did exist. It was often rudimentary and corruptible. A sheriff might be more interested in bribes than justice, or simply outnumbered and outgunned by local gangs. Jails were often flimsy structures, and escapes were common. The fear of being robbed, attacked, or swindled was a constant, low-level hum in the background of daily life. You couldn't trust strangers easily, and even those you knew might turn on you under pressure. The Wild West wasn't just physically dangerous, it was a deeply insecure place, where your life, your property, and your very existence hinged on your own vigilance and, frankly, a great deal of luck. Having navigated the treacherous landscape of lawlessness and the unpredictable nature of frontier society, you'd next confront one of the most fundamental challenges to your modern sense of convenience and speed: transportation. Forget your air-conditioned car, your bullet train, or the quick hop on a domestic flight. In the Wild West, getting from point A to point B was an arduous, perilous, and painfully slow endeavor that truly tested the limits of human endurance. Imagine needing to travel a mere 50 miles. Today, that's a quick drive, maybe an hour on the highway. In the Wild West, that could be a 2 or 3 day journey, fraught with danger, discomfort, and uncertainty. Your primary modes of transport were your own 2 feet, or, if you were fortunate, a horse or a wagon. Each came with its own set of grueling realities. Walking meant every mile was earned through sweat, blisters, and aching muscles, all while carrying your meager possessions. The sheer physical exertion required for even short distances would exhaust your modern, sedentary body almost immediately. If you had a horse, you'd quickly learn that riding isn't just a leisure activity. It's a continuous balancing act, demanding core strength, saddle endurance, and constant vigilance against unexpected terrain, agitated animals, or lurking dangers. Your legs would chafe, your back would ache, and your entire body would vibrate with every jarring hoofbeat. And remember, that horse is a living creature. It needs food, water, rest, and protection. Adding another layer of responsibility to your journey, you couldn't just pull over at a gas station. You were responsible for your own fuel and maintenance. A mainstream historical fact, wagon trains were the most common way for families to migrate westward, but they were incredibly slow, often averaging only 10 to 15 miles a day. A journey from Missouri to California could take 5 to 6 months, enduring all the previously mentioned hardships of weather, disease, and Native American encounters. Imagine being cooped up in a dusty, bumping wagon for half a year, with no suspension, no comfortable seats, and the constant fear of breakdowns or attacks. Your concept of a road trip would be forever altered. A quirky tidbit: some desperate individuals trying to travel long distances without a horse or wagon would actually attempt to ride an ox or even a cow, though these animals were notoriously slow, stubborn, and uncomfortable. Imagine trying to explain that to your modern travel agent. Historians still argue whether the physical and mental strain of these prolonged journeys contributed more to the pioneering spirit or to the widespread instances of despair and abandonment on the trail. River travel, while sometimes faster, presented its own set of dangers: treacherous currents, hidden snags, unpredictable sandbars, and the constant threat of capsizing your flatboat or keelboat. Navigating rapids, especially with all your worldly possessions, was a life-or-death gamble. There were no safety regulations, no life jackets, and certainly no Coast Guard to come to your rescue. Even stagecoaches, the luxury option for faster travel, were far from comfortable. They were bone-jarringly rough, crowded, and incredibly expensive. You'd be crammed in with strangers, enduring dust, heat, cold, and the very real threat of highwaymen. The concept of smooth roads was virtually non-existent. Most roads were little more than widened trails, deeply rutted and prone to turning into impassable mud pits after rain. Your journey was dictated by the terrain, the weather, and the endurance of your animals. Not by a schedule. There were no rest stops with clean bathrooms or convenient snacks. Just the endless, unforgiving miles. Having just survived the agonizingly slow and perilous realities of frontier transportation, your modern mind would then grapple with another profound absence: communication. Forget your instant messaging, your video calls, your email, or even a simple phone call. In the Wild West, sending a message across any significant distance was a monumental undertaking, slow to the point of absurdity, unreliable, and often fraught with danger, leaving you isolated in a way you can barely comprehend. Imagine needing to tell a family member, perhaps living just 100 miles away, that you were safe, or that a new baby had arrived. Today, you'd send a quick text or make a call. In the Old West, that news might take weeks, or even months, to arrive, if it ever did. Your primary options were letters carried by travelers, stagecoach, or eventually, the limited and expensive postal service. Each method was agonizingly slow and subject to countless delays and perils. The anticipation of news, often followed by agonizing silence, would be a constant emotional burden. A handwritten letter, perhaps your only lifeline to loved ones, had to be carefully folded, sealed with wax, if you had it, and entrusted to a stranger or a mail carrier. It might travel by horseback over rough terrain, through hostile territory, or by slow-moving wagon. It could be lost in a river crossing, stolen by bandits, or simply arrive illegibly smudged by rain or dirt. Your expectation of reliable delivery would be shattered by the harsh realities of the frontier. Every letter sent was a hopeful gamble, every letter received a precious, often long delayed, treasure. A mainstream historical fact, the U.S. Post Office Department did expand its services into frontier areas, but mail delivery was sporadic and unreliable, especially in newly settled or remote regions. Post offices were often just a corner in a general store or saloon, and the postmaster might be the only link to the outside world for miles. A quirky tidbit: some desperate individuals on long journeys would carve messages into trees or leave notes under rocks, hoping a later traveler would find and deliver them. A literal message in a bottle on land. Imagine relying on such a rudimentary system for vital information. Historians still argue whether the extreme communication isolation contributed more to the development of self-reliance among pioneers, or to increased feelings of loneliness and desperation. Consider the impact on business. If you were a merchant, ordering goods or receiving payments could take months. Decisions had to be made based on old information, or pure gut instinct, rather than current market conditions. There was no checking stock online. No swift wire transfers. Every transaction, every negotiation, was drawn out over immense periods, introducing layers of risk and uncertainty that your modern, high-speed economy simply doesn't contend with. And news of national events? Forget breaking news alerts. Major events like presidential elections or the outbreak of a war might take weeks or even months to reach the most remote settlements, often arriving as garbled rumors or outdated newspaper clippings. Your connection to the wider world would be tenuous at best, leaving you largely ignorant of anything beyond your immediate surroundings. This isn't just a lack of information, it's a profound sense of disconnection, a vast chasm between your small, isolated existence and the rest of humanity. Your sense of being part of a larger global community, constantly updated and informed, would simply cease to exist. The silence, punctuated only by local gossip and infrequent, delayed news, would be deafening. Having grasped the profound isolation imposed by the slow pace of communication and travel, your modern mind would then recoil at the sheer impracticality and discomfort of clothing. Forget your vast wardrobe, your choice of fabrics, your perfectly fitted attire for every occasion, or your understanding of breathability and style. In the Wild West, clothing was a matter of grim practicality, dictated by durability, protection, and sheer necessity, offering little comfort against the brutal environment. Imagine getting dressed in the morning, your closet, filled with soft cottons, stretchy synthetics, and lightweight linens, is replaced by a handful of coarse, heavy garments. Your outfit for the day might consist of wool, canvas, or rough denim, fabrics designed not for comfort or fashion, but for enduring abuse. These materials were scratchy against the skin, hot in the sun, and offered minimal ventilation. Your t-shirts, designed for breathability, are replaced by thick, long-sleeved shirts that offered protection from sun and thorns, but also trapped heat. You'd feel perpetually itchy and constricted. Footwear was equally unforgiving. Forget sneakers with arch support or comfortable sandals. You'd be wearing stiff leather boots, likely ill-fitting and unyielding, offering some protection from snakes and sharp rocks, but causing blisters and aching feet with every step. Imagine walking for miles in such unforgiving footgear, your feet constantly sore and blistered, without the luxury of changing into comfortable slippers at the end of the day. And if your boots wore out, replacement was a major problem, often requiring custom work from a distant cobbler or making do with patched-up rags. A mainstream historical fact, denim, originally developed for workwear due to its durability, became ubiquitous on the frontier because it could withstand the incredibly harsh conditions of mining, farming, and ranching. It wasn't a fashion statement, it was a survival essential. A quirky tidbit: some pioneers would even use rawhide, untanned animal skin, to patch holes in their clothing or fashion crude footwear when other materials were unavailable, which would become stiff and unyielding when dry, and incredibly smelly when wet. Imagine trying to wear something that smells like a damp dog and feels like cardboard. Historians still argue whether the extreme practicality of frontier clothing fostered a greater appreciation for simpler aesthetics, or simply demonstrated the utter lack of viable alternatives. Layering was important, not for style, but for adapting to the drastic temperature swings of the plains. You might start the day bundled in wool against the pre-dawn chill, only to be sweating profusely by noon and needing to shed layers, then putting them all back on as evening approached. There was no lightweight performance wear, no moisture-wicking technology. Sweat would soak into the heavy fabrics, making them cling uncomfortably and becoming a breeding ground for chafing and skin irritations. Even your accessories were practical. A wide-brimmed hat wasn't a fashion accessory. It was crucial protection from the relentless sun or driving rain. A bandana wasn't just for flair. It could be pulled up to protect your face from dust, or dipped in water to offer a moment of cooling relief. There were no sunglasses, no sunscreen, no designer scarves. Every item of clothing served a vital, practical purpose. Your concern for looking presentably dressed would be entirely replaced by the desperate need to simply be adequately covered. The concept of fashion, as you understand it, would be a meaningless relic from a soft, distant world, beyond the utilitarian nightmare of frontier clothing. Your modern dependence on advanced gadgets and specialized machinery would be completely exposed by the primitive reality of tools and technology. Forget your power drills, your instant read thermometers, your precision instruments, or even your well-stocked hardware store. In the Wild West, you'd rely on basic, often handmade, implements for everything, making even the simplest tasks laborious, time-consuming, and physically punishing. Imagine needing to build something, anything, from a fence to a small lean-to. Today, you'd head to a hardware store, pick up pre-cut lumber, use an electric saw for quick cuts, and a power drill to effortlessly sink screws. In the Old West, you'd start with an axe, a hammer, and perhaps a hand saw. Every cut, every nail, every joint would be the result of brute force and manual dexterity. Splinters would be common, mishits with the hammer would be inevitable, and the sheer inefficiency of the process would astound your modern mind. What you could do in an hour with power tools might take a full day, or even several days. With frontier implements, farming was particularly illustrative of this technological deficit. Your modern combine harvester, planting seeds with precision and harvesting vast fields in hours, is a spaceship compared to a frontier plow pulled by an ox or a horse. Planting meant walking behind a rudimentary plow, guiding it by hand, then scattering seeds by hand, and finally, hoping for rain. Harvesting involved scythes and sickles, with every stalk of wheat or corn cut, bundled, and threshed through back-breaking manual labor. Your comfortable existence, built on mechanized agriculture, would be revealed as an incredibly fragile bubble. A mainstream historical fact, the widespread adoption of standardized, mass-produced tools only really began in the latter half of the 19th century, meaning early frontier settlers often made do with whatever they could carry, barter for, or fashion themselves. Blacksmiths were essential figures, capable of forging and repairing vital metal tools. A quirky tidbit, some desperate miners would use pickaxes so dull they were more like blunt hammers, simply because they couldn't afford or find better ones, or lacked the skill to sharpen them properly. Imagine trying to chip away at rock with a glorified club. Historians still argue whether the necessity of improvising and repairing tools fostered greater ingenuity among pioneers, or if it simply led to more frustration and less efficient work. Even seemingly simple tasks were a struggle. Cooking meant tending an open fire or a cast-iron stove, constantly adjusting the heat with wood, not a precise dial. Lighting a lamp involved messy oil and a wick, with the constant risk of fire. Storing food meant relying on salting, drying, or cold cellars. Without the precision of refrigeration, your kitchen gadgets, from blenders to microwaves, would be utterly alien concepts. Navigation, too, relied on crude tools. A compass, if you had one, was a luxury. More often, you relied on the sun, stars, landmarks, and an intuitive sense of direction, honed by experience. There were no GPS devices, no detailed maps beyond rough sketches. Getting lost wasn't an inconvenience, it was a potentially fatal mistake. The entire process of daily living was slower, more laborious, and far less precise than anything you're accustomed to. Your dexterity with a smartphone keyboard would be useless, your strength with an axe handle, or your skill with a needle and thread for repairs would determine your very survival. Having come to grips with the rudimentary tools and the sheer physical effort required for daily tasks, your modern sense of security would truly crumble when confronted with the brutal reality of medical practices. Forget your sterile hospitals, your skilled surgeons, your vast array of medications, and your understanding of germ theory. In the Wild West, medicine was often primitive, painful, and dangerously ineffective, offering little hope against serious injuries or illnesses. Imagine you've suffered a compound fracture. Your bone has broken and pierced through your skin during a fall from a horse. Today, you'd be rushed to an emergency room, receive immediate pain relief, undergo surgery, and have a precise cast applied. In the Old West, you'd be lucky if there was even a doctor within 100 miles, and that doctor might be someone who learned medicine from an apprenticeship, or worse, a charlatan with no real training at all. Your arm would be set crudely, without anesthesia, by a hand that might be more accustomed to wielding an axe. The pain would be excruciating, beyond anything you've ever known, and the constant threat of infection would be far more deadly than the break itself. Surgeries, when performed, were barbaric by modern standards. Amputations were common for severe injuries or gangrene, often done with a saw and a knife, with the patient biting down on a leather strap and a swig of whiskey as the only anesthetic. The concept of sterilization was virtually unknown. Surgeons would operate with unwashed hands, dirty instruments, and often in unsanitary environments, directly introducing bacteria into open wounds. Your aversion to blood and gore, your expectation of cleanliness in medical settings, would be utterly violated. A mainstream historical fact, the widespread adoption of antiseptic practices, like washing hands and sterilizing instruments, in surgery only gained traction in the late 19th century, well after the height of the frontier era, meaning most procedures were carried out in conditions that would horrify us today. A quirky tidbit, some frontier remedies included concoctions of animal dung, tobacco, or even spider webs applied to wounds. Based on folk beliefs rather than any scientific understanding, imagine trusting a doctor who wants to put spider webs on your gaping wound. Historians still argue whether the high mortality rates from medical interventions on the frontier were primarily due to the severity of the conditions themselves or to the primitive and often harmful nature of the cures. Even simple medical knowledge was scarce. There was no understanding of bacteria, viruses, or even basic anatomy beyond the most visible organs. Fevers were often treated with bloodletting, which only weakened the patient further. Pain management was rudimentary, relying heavily on alcohol, laudanum, an opium derivative, or simply enduring the agony. You wouldn't be offered painkillers, you'd be offered oblivion, or nothing at all. Childbirth, as mentioned before, was incredibly dangerous, without trained midwives or obstetricians, without sterile environments, and without the possibility of a C-section. Complications during labor were often fatal for both mother and child. Infant and maternal mortality rates were tragically high. Your trust in modern medicine, in its ability to diagnose, treat, and cure, would be a dangerous delusion here. Every illness, every injury, every birth was a roll of the dice, with the odds often stacked heavily against you. The sheer helplessness in the face of suffering, the inability to provide comfort or effective treatment would be a crushing burden, a constant reminder of how thin the veil between life and death truly was, even with the grim reality of medical practices laid bare. There was one particular area of bodily discomfort that would plague you with relentless, excruciating agony in the Wild West: dental woes. Forget your routine dental checkups, your fluoride toothpaste, your electric toothbrush, and the marvel of modern dentistry. On the frontier, a simple toothache could swiftly become a nightmare, evolving into a life-threatening infection, or at best, leading to a crude, painful extraction. Imagine the dull throb that starts in your molar, a familiar pre-cavity warning sign that today would send you straight to the dentist for a quick filling. In the Old West, that throb would steadily intensify, becoming a relentless, hammering pain that radiates through your jaw, up into your ear, and behind your eye. There are no dentists, no pain pills beyond perhaps a swig of whiskey, which would offer fleeting relief, and absolutely no understanding of what's actually causing the agony. Your modern awareness of nerve endings and bacterial infections would only heighten your dread, knowing what's happening inside your mouth with no way to stop it. As the infection takes hold, your cheek might swell grotesquely, making it impossible to eat or even speak without excruciating pain. Fever could set in, signaling the infection is spreading without antibiotics. This oral infection could quickly move into your jawbone, then into your bloodstream, leading to sepsis, or even, horrifyingly, spread to your brain. What begins as a nuisance in your comfortable, modern life becomes a direct path to a slow, agonizing death in the untamed wilderness. A mainstream historical fact before the advent of modern dentistry. Tooth decay was incredibly common, exacerbated by diets heavy in starches and lack of oral hygiene. People often lost most or all of their teeth by middle age. A quirky tidbit: some desperate individuals would try to extract their own teeth using pliers or whatever tools they had on hand. A truly gruesome and dangerous undertaking that often led to further complications. Imagine trying to yank out your own throbbing molar with a rusty pair of blacksmith's tongs. Historians still argue whether the prevalence of tooth decay and dental pain contributed more to the hardened demeanor of frontier folk, or if it simply led to more widespread misery and a decline in overall health. When an extraction was performed, it was often by the local blacksmith, a barber, or an untrained doctor. Using crude instruments and no anesthesia, you would be held down, probably given some whiskey, and then endure the brutal wrenching and tearing of the tooth from your jaw. The pain would be unimaginable, followed by days of swelling, bleeding, and the high risk of post-extraction infection, again with no antibiotics to ward off the invisible killers. Even if you avoided infections, the consequences of poor dental health were far-reaching. Chewing became difficult, forcing you to rely on soft, easily digestible foods. Further limiting an already meager diet, speech could be impaired, and your appearance would suffer, with missing teeth marking you as a true product of the hard frontier life. Your meticulous oral hygiene routine, your biannual cleanings, your bright, confident smile, all would be relics of a pampered past. Here, every bite, every moment of relief from a toothache would be a precious, fleeting gift. Constantly overshadowed by the ever-present threat of dental disaster, the sound of someone grinding their teeth in pain at night would be a common, chilling lullaby. Having endured the phantom pain of a frontier toothache, your thoughts might turn to the very beginning of life. And here, your modern assumptions about safety and medical support would be utterly shattered by the stark realities of childbirth. Forget sterile hospital delivery rooms, epidurals, fetal monitoring, or expert obstetricians ready for any complication. In the Wild West, bringing a new life into the world was an incredibly perilous journey for both mother and child, with high mortality rates and little recourse against tragedy. Imagine the onset of labor. Today, you'd head to a hospital, secure in the knowledge that trained professionals and advanced medical technology are at your disposal. On the frontier, you'd likely be in a small, remote cabin, perhaps with only a few other women, an untrained midwife, or even just your husband, by your side. There are no pain medications beyond perhaps a folk remedy or a sip of alcohol, which would offer only fleeting, meager relief. The pain would be raw, intense, and prolonged, with no expectation of an epidural to ease your suffering. The process could stretch for hours, even days, and every minute would be fraught with anxiety. Complications that are easily managed today, a breech birth, a prolonged labor, excessive bleeding, were often fatal. There were no C-sections, no blood transfusions, no incubators for premature babies. If the baby struggled to be born, or if the mother hemorrhaged, there was little to nothing that could be done. Your hope, your very life, would rest on the strength of your own body and a heavy dose of sheer luck. A mainstream historical fact, maternal and infant mortality rates on the frontier were significantly higher than in more settled areas, and, tragically, a common part of life. Many women died in childbirth, and many infants did not survive their first year. A quirky tidbit: some frontier communities practiced lying-in customs, where new mothers were confined to bed for several weeks after birth, purportedly for recovery, though often exacerbating isolation and depression. Imagine being confined like that after such a traumatic event, with no modern comforts or psychological support. Historians still argue whether the high birth rates on the frontier, despite the dangers, reflected a stoic acceptance of risk or simply the lack of reliable contraception and societal pressures. The environment itself was hostile to newborns, without proper heating. Babies were vulnerable to the cold, without understanding of germ theory. Simple infections, from a cut umbilical cord to a minor rash, could quickly turn deadly. There were no disposable diapers, no sterile bottles, no ready-made formula. Every aspect of infant care was a labour-intensive battle against dirt and disease. The joy of a new arrival was always tempered by the constant, unspoken fear of loss. Even if both mother and child survived, the toll on the woman's body was immense, with often permanent physical damage from repeated difficult births. There was no concept of postpartum recovery as we understand it, no gentle easing back into life. You would be expected to resume your demanding chores as soon as physically possible, often still weak and in pain. The memory of the agonizing birth would linger, a constant reminder of the fragility of life on the frontier, the serene image of a newborn baby in a pristine nursery. A common sight today would be a stark, almost unimaginable contrast to the bloody, dangerous, and often solitary reality of birth in the Wild West. Having witnessed the profound fragility of life's beginning in the Wild West, your modern sensibilities would next confront the stark absence of readily available education. Forget your public schools, your libraries brimming with books, your internet access to infinite knowledge, or your general expectation of literacy. On the frontier, formal schooling was a rare luxury, often rudimentary, and available only to the privileged few or those in more established communities, leaving most with practical skills but limited access to broader knowledge. Imagine a child growing up on the vast plains. Your modern upbringing included years of structured schooling, access to textbooks, and the guidance of trained teachers. In the Old West, that child might learn to read and write from a worn family Bible, or perhaps a single, tattered primer. Their classroom would be the open fields, the dusty trails, and the inside of their own cabin, where practical skills like farming, hunting, cooking, or mending clothes were prioritized over academic pursuits. The concept of a universal, free education system was decades, if not a century, away. Many frontier children received no formal education at all. Their days were filled with chores essential for family survival, tending livestock, fetching water, gathering firewood, helping with planting and harvesting. There was little time or energy for reading, writing, or arithmetic when the very existence of the family depended on their labor. Your appreciation for the effortless access to information and learning that defines your life would be profound. A mainstream historical fact, one-room schoolhouses were the primary form of organized education on the frontier, often serving students of all ages simultaneously, with a single, often underpaid and undertrained teacher. These schools were usually only open for a few months a year, when children weren't needed for farm work, and attendance was often sporadic. A quirky tidbit, sometimes, if a community couldn't afford a teacher, a literate parent or even an older sibling would take on the role, teaching what they knew, often without proper materials. Imagine your entire formal education coming from a neighbor who barely finished primary school themselves. Historians still argue whether the practical, hands-on learning prevalent on the frontier fostered a more resilient and self-sufficient populace, or if the lack of formal education hindered long-term societal progress. Access to books was incredibly limited. Forget public libraries or even small bookstores. A family might own a Bible, an almanac, and perhaps one or two other cherished books, which were read and reread until they fell apart. News came from infrequent newspapers, often weeks or months old, or from travelers bringing gossip and rumors. Your ability to instantly research any topic, to read countless articles and books at your fingertips, would seem like an unimaginable magic to a frontiersman. The implications of this limited education were far-reaching. Superstition often filled the gaps left by scientific understanding. Without widespread literacy, communication beyond spoken word was difficult. slowing the spread of ideas and innovations. Opportunities for social mobility, which often hinged on education, were severely restricted. Your current world, where knowledge is power and information is currency, stands in stark contrast to a time when basic literacy was a privilege, and deep learning was the domain of the very few. The quiet hum of your internet connection and the vast digital library at your disposal would feel like a monumental, almost fantastical, achievement. With the limited access to formal education firmly in mind, your highly individualized and often fluid modern life would quickly clash with the rigid, often unwritten rules of social etiquette on the frontier. Forget the polite pleasantries, the casual interactions, or the nuanced social cues you navigate daily. Here, understanding and adhering to a different, often blunt, set of social codes was crucial for survival, or you could quickly find yourself ostracized, in a dispute, or even in mortal danger. Imagine stepping into a small frontier settlement. Your immediate instinct might be to make polite conversation, perhaps ask personal questions, or express your opinions freely. In the Wild West, that could be a serious mistake. Trust was earned slowly, often through shared hardship. Strangers were viewed with suspicion until proven otherwise. Asking too many questions, being overly familiar, or displaying overt weakness could mark you as a target. Your modern openness and casual demeanor would need to be reined in, replaced by a cautious reserve. Respect was paramount. But it was often shown through actions, not just words. A man's word was often his bond. More so than written contracts in many instances, failure to honor a promise, or a perceived slight, could lead to swift and violent retribution. There were no HR departments to mediate disputes, no social workers to intervene. Your ability to navigate these unspoken rules, to read the subtle cues of body language and tone in a community where everyone knew everyone else's business, would be vital. A mainstream historical fact, the concept of honor was deeply ingrained in frontier society, particularly among men, and perceived insults often led to duels or immediate gunfights. This wasn't just a Hollywood trope, it was a grim reality, a quirky tidbit. In some areas, it was considered impolite, even suspicious. For a man to enter a saloon without first removing his hat, even if he kept it on inside for warmth, imagine your modern fashion choices being a potential trigger for a bar brawl. Historians still argue whether the extreme emphasis on honor and self-reliance in frontier etiquette fostered a stronger sense of personal integrity, or simply perpetuated a cycle of unnecessary violence. Social interactions were often simpler, but more intense. Greetings might be curt, but a genuine offer of help in a time of need spoke volumes. Borrowing equipment or supplies carried a heavy obligation to repay, and failing to do so could lead to your ostracization from the community, a death sentence in an isolated environment. Your modern comfort with casual acquaintances and fleeting interactions would be replaced by a reliance on a small, tightly knit group of trusted individuals. Gender roles, as we'll discuss, were strictly defined, and navigating them required careful adherence to expectations. A woman might not be expected to speak her mind freely in mixed company, and a man was expected to be stoic and capable. Crossing these lines, even unintentionally, could cause social friction. The lines between friend and foe could be drawn swiftly and irrevocably based on a single misinterpreted gesture or word. Your nuanced understanding of modern social dynamics, your ability to adapt to diverse groups, would be tested by a society that often valued conformity and stark and unambiguous displays of character. The polite smile and gentle nod of your current interactions would feel like fragile, useless tools in a world where trust was a currency harder to earn than gold. Building on the intricate and often dangerous landscape of frontier social etiquette, your modern understanding of diversity and equality would be profoundly challenged by the complex and often brutal reality of race relations. Forget your laws against discrimination, your movements for civil rights, or your general awareness of cultural sensitivity. In the Wild West, interactions between diverse groups were often fraught with tension, prejudice, and outright violence, with survival frequently depending on who you were and the color of your skin. Imagine yourself as an Irish immigrant, newly arrived on the frontier, hoping for a fresh start. While you might expect prejudice, you'd quickly discover that ethnic groups like the Irish and Chinese, who were often essential for building railroads or working in mines, faced intense discrimination, resentment, and even violence from established white settlers. Your modern concepts of workplace equality and fair treatment would be utterly absent. You'd be confined to the hardest, most dangerous jobs, paid less, and subject to constant derogatory remarks and physical attacks for African Americans, many of whom sought freedom and opportunity after the Civil War. The frontier was a land of both possibility and profound danger. While some found relative freedom in all-black towns or served as buffalo soldiers in the U.S. Army, others faced the harsh realities of segregation, prejudice, and violence that mirrored, or even intensified, the racism found in the more established states. Your understanding of legal protections would offer no shield against the deeply ingrained biases of the era. A mainstream historical fact, Chinese immigrants, essential to the construction of the Transcontinental Railroad, faced extreme prejudice, violent attacks, and discriminatory laws, often being forced into segregated communities and denied basic rights. A quirky tidbit, some frontier towns had specific sundown town rules, explicitly forbidding black or Chinese people from being within town limits after dark, under threat of violence. Imagine being forced to leave a town just because of your ethnicity when the sun went down. Historians still argue whether the perceived opportunities of the frontier truly outweighed the racial discrimination faced by non-white populations, or if it simply offered a different, but equally harsh, set of challenges. Perhaps most significantly were the interactions with Native American tribes. This wasn't a matter of cultural exchange or mutual respect, it was an ongoing struggle over land, resources, and conflicting ways of life that often erupted into brutal conflict. Settlers viewed Native Americans as obstacles to progress, while tribes fought desperately to protect their ancestral lands and traditions. Your modern understanding of indigenous rights and treaties would be utterly irrelevant in a time when government policy often aimed at forced removal and assimilation. Backed by military force, you, as a frontier individual, would be caught in this complex web. Depending on your background, you might be a perpetrator, a victim, or simply a bystander to acts of prejudice and violence. There was no easy escape from the deeply embedded racial tensions of the era. Your comfort with diverse populations, your expectation of inclusive spaces, would be replaced by an acute awareness of racial hierarchies and the constant threat of intergroup conflict. The Wild West was a melting pot, but often, it was a melting pot that boiled over with resentment and violence, where your very existence could be dictated by the perceived place of your race or ethnicity. After navigating the fraught landscape of frontier race relations, your modern mind, shaped by evolving views on equality, would then encounter the stark and unyielding reality of gender roles. Forget your fluid definitions of masculinity and femininity, your career choices unfettered by traditional expectations, or your freedom to pursue individual passions regardless of sex. In the Wild West, societal expectations for men and women were rigidly defined, dictating almost every aspect of daily life, limiting individual choices, and demanding immense fortitude. Imagine yourself as a woman on the frontier. Your life, once filled with possibilities for education, career, and personal pursuits, would be instantly funneled into a demanding, almost ceaseless cycle of domestic labor and child-rearing. Your primary role would be to maintain the household, often a single, rough cabin, which meant cooking over an open fire, preserving food with rudimentary methods, mending clothes by hand, cleaning with limited resources, and constantly fetching water and firewood. Your modern convenience appliances are gone. Every meal, every clean garment, every drop of warm water is the result of immense physical effort. The concept of leisure time for women was practically non-existent. Childbearing was not just a perilous event, as we've discussed, but a continuous expectation. Large families were common, partly out of necessity for labor, partly due to lack of birth control. This meant constant pregnancies, births, and the care of numerous children, often in harsh conditions, with little support beyond other women in the community. Your modern understanding of reproductive rights and family planning would be completely alien. A mainstream historical fact, while women on the frontier often worked alongside men in physical labor, Their primary identity and value were still largely tied to their roles as wives and mothers, homemakers and moral guardians. This domestic sphere, however, was often far more physically demanding than urban equivalents. A quirky tidbit: some frontier women were so adept at traditionally male skills out of necessity, like shooting or riding, that they earned reputations as skilled marksmen or horsewomen, quietly challenging norms through sheer survival. Historians still argue whether the extreme hardships faced by frontier women ultimately empowered them through necessity, fostering resilience and independence, or if it simply trapped them in an even more arduous version of traditional domesticity. For men, the expectations were equally rigid. You would be the provider and protector, responsible for securing food, building shelter, breaking land, and defending your family from every conceivable threat. Your masculinity would be defined by your physical strength, your ability to handle a gun, your stoicism in the face of hardship, and your capacity to work from dawn till dusk. Your emotional expression would likely be suppressed. Displays of vulnerability were often seen as weakness, leaving little room for introspection or sharing feelings. The division of labor was stark. Men handled the external threats and heavy physical work outdoors. Women managed the internal workings of the home and raised the children. There was little blurring of these lines, and individuals who deviated too much from these roles often faced social censure or struggled to survive. Your modern freedom to choose your own path, to define your own identity outside of traditional gender norms, would be a fantasy. Here, your role was largely predetermined, and your ability to fulfill it was a matter of survival for yourself and your entire family. The pressures to conform, to simply do your part, were immense and inescapable. Having just navigated the restrictive gender roles of the Wild West, your modern sensibilities, steeped in due process and judicial systems, would be utterly horrified by the grim reality of frontier justice. Forget police investigations, court trials, appeals, or the concept of innocent until proven guilty. On the frontier, law enforcement was often crude, swift, and brutal, with vigilantes frequently taking matters into their own hands, and might truly making right. Imagine you're accused of stealing a horse, whether guilty or not. Today, you'd have the right to an attorney, to present evidence, and to a trial by jury. In the Old West, you might find yourself facing an angry mob, or a self-appointed vigilance committee with no legal training and a strong belief in immediate retribution. Your trial could consist of a quick interrogation, a few biased testimonies, and a swift verdict delivered by men with ropes in their hands. The concept of a fair hearing, of meticulous evidence gathering, was practically non-existent. Public hangings were not just a form of execution, they were spectacles, often drawing crowds, and serving as a stark warning to others. These weren't sanctioned by the state in many cases, but rather carried out by local citizens frustrated by the lack of official law and order. The very public nature of such events was meant to instill fear and enforce a rough form of justice. Your comfort with abstract legal concepts and the slow wheels of bureaucracy would be replaced by the raw, terrifying immediacy of summary judgment. A mainstream historical fact: vigilante groups flourished in many frontier areas, particularly in mining camps and cattle towns, where official law enforcement was weak or absent. These groups often dispensed their own brand of justice, which could be effective in deterring crime, but was also prone to abuse, mistaken identity, and racial prejudice. A quirky tidbit: some notorious outlaws, upon capture, were actually granted a form of trial by combat or a chance to escape, if they were particularly charismatic or had a reputation for bravery, before facing the gallows. Imagine your fate being decided by a fight to the death. Historians still argue whether the widespread reliance on vigilante justice, despite its brutality, was a necessary stage in the development of order on the frontier, or if it simply entrenched a culture of violence that was difficult to later dismantle. Even where formal law enforcement existed, it was often rudimentary. A sheriff might cover hundreds of square miles, riding alone, with limited resources. Jails were frequently flimsy wooden structures, easy to break out of, or simply makeshift tents. Capturing a criminal was one challenge. Holding them and transporting them for trial across vast distances was another entirely. This meant that swift, decisive action, even if extra-legal, was often seen as the only practical solution to rampant crime. Your understanding of rehabilitation or even complex motivations for crime would be completely irrelevant. Justice was simple, punishment for wrongdoing, often severe and immediate, meant to deter others. The legal nuances you're familiar with, mitigating circumstances, psychological evaluations, differing degrees of guilt, were largely absent. It was a world of black and white, right and wrong, with very little grey area. The fear of being wrongly accused, of falling victim to a mob's fury, would add another chilling layer to your daily existence. Every dispute, every argument, carried the potential for swift, irreversible, and deadly resolution. Without the comforting buffer of a fair and impartial legal system, having glimpsed the brutal simplicity of frontier justice, your modern economic sensibilities, accustomed to stable markets, digital transactions, and universal currency, would then be utterly bewildered by the chaotic reality of the economy. Forget stock markets, credit cards, or predictable income. On the frontier, money was often scarce, trade was king, and local economies were subject to dramatic boom and bust cycles, with fortunes rising and falling with dizzying speed. Imagine needing to buy supplies for your journey or your new homestead today. You'd use a debit card, or perhaps some cash. In the Wild West, cash money was often in short supply, especially in remote areas. Gold dust, silver coins, or even foreign currency might be accepted, but often at varying rates. More commonly, you'd rely on barter. Your labor might be traded for supplies, your goods for someone else's services. This required constant negotiation, a keen eye for value, and an understanding that your worth wasn't always measured in dollars. Your modern expectation of fixed prices and easy transactions would be constantly frustrated. The value of goods was highly localized and volatile. A sack of flour that cost one price in a well-established town might cost 10 times that in a remote mining camp. Simply because of the difficulty and danger of transportation, scarcity drove prices sky high. Your online price comparison tools and discount apps would be completely useless. You paid what the local merchant demanded, or you went without. This created an environment where merchants held immense power, and consumers were often at their mercy. A mainstream historical fact, gold rushes and silver strikes created intense but often short-lived economic booms. Towns would spring up overnight, attracting thousands, only to become ghost towns years later when the mineral deposits ran out. A quirky tidbit, some frontier store owners would accept unusual forms of payment, like animal furs, personal tools, or even promises of future labor, due to the desperate need for goods in isolated areas. Imagine trying to pay for groceries with a beaver pelt or a promise to fix someone's fence next month. Historians still argue whether the extreme volatility of the frontier economy primarily fostered risk-taking entrepreneurship, or if it simply led to greater economic insecurity and widespread financial ruin for many. The concept of a stable job or a predictable income was a distant dream for many. Miners hoped for a strike. Farmers prayed for a good harvest that wouldn't be destroyed by drought or locusts, and merchants gambled on the fluctuating demand for goods. Financial security was a rare and fleeting state. Debt was a constant companion for many, and the inability to pay could lead to the loss of your land, your possessions, or even your freedom in some instances. There were no bankruptcy laws to protect you, no safety nets for those who failed, and credit, while informal credit existed, it was often based on personal reputation and trust, rather than a formal system. A tab at the general store could quickly run up, and if you couldn't pay, your relationship with the merchant, and thus your access to essential supplies, would be severed. Your current world, where borrowing money is as easy as swiping a card, stands in stark contrast to a time when every transaction was a tangible exchange, and economic survival was a constant, nerve-wracking gamble against nature and market whims. The sound of coins clinking in a pocket, a rare and precious sound, would signify true wealth. With the precarious nature of the frontier economy firmly established, your gaze would undoubtedly be drawn to one of its most iconic, yet often brutally deceptive facets: mining life. Forget the modern image of organized corporate mining operations with safety regulations and sophisticated machinery. In the Wild West, The lure of gold and silver brought masses of hopefuls, but the reality was often squalor, back-breaking labor, devastating disappointment, and a constant dance with danger. Imagine arriving at a burgeoning mining camp. Your modern expectation of clean, organized living spaces is immediately shattered by the sight of muddy tents, crude shacks, and makeshift structures clinging precariously to hillsides. The air is thick with dust, the smell of unwashed bodies, stale whiskey, and the metallic tang of earth. This isn't a vacation, this is a desperate gamble, and your comfort levels plummet the moment you step off your weary horse or out of your dusty wagon. Your workplace would be a hand-dug hole in the ground, a treacherous tunnel, or a frigid stream bed using rudimentary picks, shovels, and pans. You'd spend endless hours chipping away at rock, sifting through gravel, or sluicing murky water, often in cramped, dark, and dangerous conditions. Your back would ache, your hands would blister, and your lungs would fill with dust. There were no safety inspections, no hard hats, no ventilation systems. Cave-ins were common. Explosions from unstable black powder were a constant threat, and the risk of developing lung diseases from inhaling dust was almost guaranteed. Your current awareness of workplace safety would be a source of constant, terrifying anxiety. A mainstream historical fact, the vast majority of prospectors in any gold rush never struck it rich. Only a tiny percentage found enough gold to make a significant profit, while many others lost everything, including their lives. A quirky tidbit: some desperate miners would literally pan for gold in their dreams, believing that certain dream imagery, like finding a yellow cat, would lead them to a real strike. Imagine letting your subconscious dictate your next digging spot. Historians still argue whether the dream of striking it rich fostered greater perseverance among miners, or if it simply led to a collective delusion that blinded them to the brutal realities and low odds of success. The living conditions were equally harsh. Food was expensive and monotonous, often just beans, hardtack, and tough salted meat. Water was scarce and often contaminated. Disease spread like wildfire through the crowded, unsanitary camps. A simple fever could send you to an early grave, with no medical help available. Your desire for a comfortable bed and a warm meal would be replaced by the constant gnawing of hunger and fatigue. The psychological toll was immense. The relentless grind of labor, coupled with the often frustrating lack of success, led to widespread despair, alcoholism, and violence. Dreams of instant wealth quickly turned into a soul-crushing reality of endless toil and meager returns. Your emotional well-being, usually supported by a sense of progress and stability, would be eroded by the constant cycle of hope and crushing disappointment. The Wild West's mining life was a brutal lottery, and most participants drew a losing ticket, forever marked by the dust, the dreams, and the despair of the diggings. The occasional gleam of gold, however, was enough to keep the relentless cycle turning. If the harsh, often futile, pursuit of wealth in the mines didn't claim you, then the steady, back-breaking grind of farming and ranching surely would have tested your limits in the Wild West. Forget your climate-controlled tractors, your automated irrigation systems, your carefully optimized crop rotations, or your supermarket shelves overflowing with produce. Here, survival depended entirely on grueling physical labor, battling relentless nature, and hoping against hope for a good harvest or healthy herd. Imagine waking before dawn, not to the gentle chirping of birds, but to the urgent demands of livestock or the chilling bite of the morning air. Your office is a vast, untamed plot of land, stretching to the horizon, often choked with rocks, prairie grass, or stubborn tree stumps. Your first task might be to hitch a team of oxen or horses to a heavy, unwieldy plow, then spend hours, sometimes days, wrestling it through stubborn soil, breaking ground that had never seen a human footprint. Your muscles, accustomed to sitting at a desk or light exercise, would scream in protest within minutes. Every acre cleared, every furrow turned, would be a testament to sheer willpower. Planting was just as laborious. Seeds were often sown by hand, scattered across the freshly tilled earth, then covered, all while hoping birds or insects wouldn't devour them before they had a chance to sprout. Then came the agonizing wait. constantly checking the sky for rain, fearing drought, or praying against sudden hailstorms that could wipe out a season's work in minutes. Your expectation of predictable yields, supported by agricultural science and insurance, would be a cruel joke here. A mainstream historical fact, the vast majority of frontier settlers were farmers, relying on subsistence agriculture to feed their families. With little surplus to sell, their lives were intimately tied to the cycles of nature, and a single bad season could mean starvation. A quirky tidbit, some desperate farmers would try rain-making rituals, anything from special dances to firing cannons into the sky, in a futile attempt to summon precipitation during droughts. Imagine resorting to such measures, driven by pure desperation. Historians still argue whether the extreme self-reliance demanded by frontier farming fostered an unbreakable spirit of independence, or if it simply led to more widespread hardship and an early grave for many. Ranching, too, was a relentless cycle of toil and danger, herding cattle across vast, unfenced plains, protecting them from rustlers and predators, branding them, and then enduring the grueling cattle drives to distant markets. This was not the romanticized life of a cowboy you see in films. It was dirty, dangerous work, requiring immense skill with a horse and a lasso, and constant vigilance. Your clean office attire would be replaced by dust-caked denim and sweat-stained leather. Beyond the physical labor, the mental strain was immense. You were constantly battling pests, from locusts that devoured entire fields to prairie dogs that burrowed under fences. You fought against unpredictable weather, market fluctuations, and the ever-present threat of fire. A single spark from a campfire or a lightning strike could turn your entire livelihood into ashes in moments. Your understanding of controlled environments and predictable outcomes would be shattered. Every day was a gamble, every crop a prayer, every animal a precious investment. The satisfaction of a successful harvest or a healthy herd was immense, but it was earned through an unrelenting, soul-crushing grind that would make your modern work-life balance seem like an absurd luxury. After the grueling realities of farming and ranching, your modern desire for entertainment and social interaction would inevitably lead you to the most iconic, yet often dangerous, social hub of the Wild West, the saloon. Forget your clean, well-lit bars with craft cocktails and curated playlists. Here, the saloon was far more than just a place to drink. It was a rough-and-tumble epicenter of social life, gambling, fleeting entertainment, and frequently, explosive violence. Imagine pushing open a set of swinging doors, not to the muffled hum of conversation, but to a cacophony of sounds, the raucous laughter of men, the clinking of glasses, the rhythmic thud of cards hitting a table, the discordant twang of a cheap piano, and the pervasive smell of stale tobacco smoke, spilled whiskey, and unwashed bodies. Your modern aversion to loud, crowded, and unsanitary spaces would be immediately assaulted. The floor would be covered in sawdust, spit, and perhaps something far less pleasant. The bar itself was usually a rough wooden counter, serving mostly whiskey, often raw, potent, and of questionable origin, and perhaps some watered-down beer. Your desire for a nuanced drink menu or a precisely poured pint would be irrelevant. You drank what was available, and you drank it quickly. This wasn't about savoring a beverage, it was about dulling the endless pain of frontier life, seeking courage, or simply passing the time. A mainstream historical fact, saloons were often the first permanent businesses established in new frontier towns, serving as community centers where news was exchanged, business deals were struck, and mail might even be picked up. They were more than just drinking establishments, they were vital social infrastructure. A quirky tidbit, some saloons had free lunch counters, where patrons who bought drinks could help themselves to salty foods like crackers, cheese, and sometimes even tougher cuts of meat, intended to make them thirstier and buy more alcohol. Imagine your local pub offering a questionable buffet just to keep you drinking. Historians still argue whether the prevalence of saloons on the frontier primarily fostered community bonds, or if they were largely responsible for the rampant alcoholism and violence that plagued many towns. Beyond the drinking, Gambling was a central activity. Poker, faro, and various card games were played for high stakes, often with loaded dice or marked cards. Fortunes could be won and lost in a single hand, leading to euphoria for some and utter despair, and often violence for others. Your understanding of regulated casinos and consumer protection would be utterly irrelevant. Here, the house often cheated, and disputes were settled with fists or firearms, not legal arbitration. Entertainment, too, was rudimentary. A lone piano player might pound out tunes, or a dance hall girl might offer companionship for a price. These weren't sophisticated theatrical productions, they were raw, often desperate forms of distraction from the harsh realities outside. The atmosphere, while sometimes convivial, was always on a knife edge. A quick temper, a perceived insult, or too much cheap whiskey could turn a lively gathering into a deadly shootout in an instant. Your expectation of a safe, regulated social environment would be shattered by the constant underlying tension. The Wild West Saloon wasn't just a place to unwind, it was a microcosm of the entire frontier, a place of fleeting pleasure and ever-present danger. From the raucous, often dangerous, environment of the frontier saloon, your modern fascination with quick gains would inevitably lead you to gambling. Forget your regulated online casinos, your meticulously calculated odds, or your credit card limits. In the Wild West, gambling was a high-stakes, high-risk affair where fortunes could be made or lost in an instant, often fueled by desperation and leading directly to conflict and ruin. Imagine a group huddled around a rickety table, the air thick with smoke and anticipation, the clatter of chips, the rustle of cards, the sharp snap of a dealer's wrist. These are the sounds of destiny being played out. Your understanding of odds, of responsible betting, would be put to the ultimate test. Here, the stakes weren't just a few dollars, they were often entire life savings, the deed to a mine claim, or even the very horse that brought you into town. The pressure would be immense. The temptation to risk everything, overwhelming. Poker, faro, and various dice games were the main attractions. Faro, in particular, was notorious for being rigged, with the house holding an almost insurmountable advantage. Your modern skepticism about fairness would be well-founded, but often useless. You'd watch a smooth-talking dealer, perhaps with a subtle glint in his eye, knowing that he might be manipulating the deck with unseen skill. The frustration of being consistently beaten, the slow bleed of your meager funds, would gnaw at your soul. A mainstream historical fact, professional gamblers, often called card sharps or swindlers, were common figures in frontier towns, preying on inexperienced miners, cowboys, and travelers. Their skills in cheating were legendary, and often their downfall. A quirky tidbit, some desperate players, after losing everything, would resort to betting their personal possessions, from their watch to their boots, in a last-ditch attempt to win back their fortunes. Imagine losing your last remaining pair of boots in a poker game, leaving you barefoot and stranded. Historians still argue whether the widespread acceptance of gambling on the frontier reflected a general spirit of risk-taking, or if it was simply a symptom of the economic instability and lack of other entertainment options. The stakes weren't just financial. Losing could lead to deep despair, to self-destruction through drink, or to violent confrontations. Disputes over cheating were common, and often settled not by a referee, but by a swift drawing of a pistol. Your modern inclination to report suspicious activity to authorities would be met with laughter, or worse, with hostility. The only referee was often the fastest gun in the room. Winning, too, carried its own dangers. A large sum of cash, displayed openly at a table, made you an immediate target for desperate men or opportunistic thieves. You couldn't just deposit your winnings into a bank account, you had to carry your wealth, making you a walking target. The fleeting thrill of winning would be quickly overshadowed by the chilling fear of being robbed or murdered for your newfound riches. Your concept of secure financial transactions and personal safety would be completely upended. The bright lights and exciting sounds of a modern casino, designed to create a fun illusion, pale in comparison to the raw, visceral tension of a frontier gambling hall. where every bet was a gamble, not just of money, but often of life itself. Having seen the perils of high-stakes gambling, your modern sense of security would truly crumble when confronted with the ever-present threat of outlaws and bandits. Forget your sophisticated law enforcement agencies, your rapid response teams, or your general expectation of safety on the road. In the Wild West, lawless individuals roamed freely, posing a constant, terrifying threat to travelers, settlers, and businesses, making every journey and every settlement a risky endeavor. Imagine you're traveling along a dusty trail, perhaps in a stagecoach or a lonely wagon. Your modern mind anticipates a relatively uneventful drive. In the Old West, every turn in the road, every clump of trees, every distant rider on the horizon could conceal a band of highwaymen. The chilling shout of "stand and deliver" or the sudden crack of rifle fire from an ambush would be your terrifying reality. Your comfortable sense of invulnerability on the open road would be shattered by the raw, visceral fear of imminent robbery or violence. These weren't just petty thieves, many were hardened criminals, often desperate, with nothing to lose. They targeted stagecoaches laden with gold, isolated ranches, small-town banks, or even individual travelers thought to be carrying cash or valuables. Your understanding of legal protections or calling for help would be useless. Resistance often meant death, and even compliance offered no guarantee of safety. You'd quickly learn to look over your shoulder, to carry a weapon, and to trust no one you didn't know intimately. A mainstream historical fact, legendary figures like Jesse James, Billy the Kid, and the Dalton Gang became infamous for their train and bank robberies, operating across vast territories where law enforcement was thin and communications were slow. These weren't just isolated incidents, they were a pervasive problem. A quirky tidbit, some desperate bandits would disguise themselves as religious preachers or traveling salesmen to get close to unsuspecting victims before revealing their true intentions. Imagine offering hospitality to a seemingly kindly stranger, only for them to pull a gun on you. Historians still argue whether the romanticized image of outlaws as daring rebels overshadowed the brutal reality of their crimes and the widespread fear they instilled. The threat wasn't confined to the trails. Even settled towns lived under the shadow of these gangs. A quiet night could be shattered by the sound of gunfire as a bank was raided or a store was looted. Farmers and ranchers lived in constant fear of rustlers stealing their precious livestock, their livelihood disappearing overnight. There was no insurance to cover your losses, no government programs to reimburse you. Your financial security, and often your very survival, depended on your ability to protect what was yours, often with a gun. The lack of effective communication and rapid transportation meant that outlaws could strike and then disappear into the vast wilderness before news of their crimes reached authorities. By the time a posse could be formed and dispatched, the bandits were often long gone, melting into the landscape. This created a sense of impotence and frustration among settlers and lawmen alike. Your expectation of swift justice or widespread apprehension of criminals would be a pipe dream. The Wild West was a land where the bad guys often won, at least for a time, and every shadow, every unfamiliar face, carried the chilling potential of becoming your last. Beyond the internal threats of banditry and violence, your modern understanding of land ownership and sovereignty would collide brutally with the complex and often tragic reality of Native American relations. Forget peaceful coexistence or quaint historical reenactments. In the Wild West, interactions with indigenous tribes were a continuous, often escalating, conflict over land, resources, and clashing ways of life, leading to violent confrontations, forced displacement, and immense suffering. Imagine arriving as a settler, eager to claim land and build a new life. Your modern concept of empty land or manifest destiny would immediately clash with the undeniable fact that these lands were already occupied, often for centuries, by diverse and distinct Native American nations with their own cultures, languages, and spiritual connections to the territory. Your presence, however innocent your intentions, was seen as an invasion, and rightfully so. The quiet beauty of the landscape would be overshadowed by the deep-seated tension and the very real threat of armed conflict. From the perspective of many Native American tribes, The encroachment of white settlers meant the destruction of their traditional hunting grounds, the breaking of sacred treaties, and the systematic erosion of their way of life. They saw their lands being taken, their buffalo herds decimated, and their very existence threatened. Their resistance, often fierce and desperate, was met with overwhelming military force by the US Army. Your modern awareness of historical injustice and indigenous rights would make you a deeply uncomfortable participant in this unfolding tragedy. A mainstream historical fact, the latter half of the 19th century saw numerous conflicts, often referred to as the Indian Wars, between the US Army and various Native American tribes, including the Sioux, Cheyenne, Apache, and Nez Perce, resulting in significant loss of life on both sides and the forced relocation of tribes to reservations. A quirky tidbit: some desperate tribal leaders, after devastating defeats, would actually attempt to appeal directly to the US president in Washington, D.C., sometimes traveling thousands of miles to plead their case, often with little success. Imagine a desperate chief, clad in traditional attire, trying to reason with the highest authority of an invading nation. Historians still argue whether the US government's policies towards Native Americans were primarily driven by a misguided belief in civilizing them, or by a cynical desire to seize their lands and resources. You, as a settler, would be constantly aware of the presence of Native American tribes, depending on the specific tribe and the local circumstances. Encounters could range from wary observation to violent ambush. The fear of raids, of losing your livestock or even your family, was a constant reality for those living on the edges of native territories. Conversely, Native Americans lived with the daily fear of reprisal, of settler violence, or of the US Army appearing to enforce new, often unfavorable, treaties. The conflict wasn't just military, it was cultural. The differing worldviews, the misunderstanding, and the outright contempt often fueled the violence. Your modern understanding of cultural relativism and mutual respect would be completely out of place in an era dominated by notions of racial superiority and expansionist ambition. The Wild West was a land forged in the crucible of this conflict, where the displacement of one people was seen as the necessary foundation for the prosperity of another. Leaving a legacy of pain and injustice that echoes to this day, the very ground you stood on was often contested, a silent battleground of wills and traditions. Following the grim and often heartbreaking reality of Native American relations, your modern comfort with established governmental structures would confront the complex and often brutal role of the army. Forget your images of well-equipped, technologically advanced military forces acting as peacekeepers. In the Wild West, the US Army was often the primary, and sometimes only, arm of federal authority, tasked with maintaining a fragile peace, protecting settlers, and enforcing policies of expansion and control, often through harsh and violent means. Imagine yourself on the frontier, perhaps as a lone farmer or a small-town merchant. The presence of a military fort or a passing patrol of cavalry soldiers would be a mix of reassurance and apprehension. On one hand, they represented a potential defense against Native American raids, bandits, or other threats to order. On the other, their presence often brought its own set of problems: rowdy soldiers, economic disruptions, and the stark reality of military power overriding local sensibilities. Your sense of civilian oversight and accountability would be tenuous at best. The US Army's primary role on the frontier was multifaceted. They built and maintained forts, which served as strategic outposts, supply depots, and points of refuge. They escorted wagon trains and stagecoaches, providing protection against attacks. Most significantly, they were the instrument of government policy regarding Native American tribes, enforcing treaties, suppressing resistance, and often participating in campaigns that led to forced displacement and massacres. Your current understanding of a military's role in a democratic society would be challenged by their expansive and often aggressive duties. A mainstream historical fact: the post-Civil War US Army on the frontier was relatively small, often spread thin across vast distances, and comprised of a diverse group of soldiers, including former Union and Confederate veterans, immigrants, and African American Buffalo soldiers. A quirky tidbit: sometimes, Army detachments would be tasked with mundane but vital duties like surveying land or even guarding telegraph lines, transforming soldiers into reluctant infrastructure workers. Imagine your military serving as glorified land surveyors or telegraph pole watchers. Historians still argue whether the US's Army's actions on the frontier were a necessary evil for westward expansion and the establishment of order, or if their campaigns against Native Americans constituted acts of genocide and unjust conquest. Life as a soldier on the frontier was far from glamorous. Conditions were harsh, pay was low, and disease was rampant. They often faced loneliness, boredom, and the constant threat of sudden, brutal combat. Their diet was monotonous, their uniforms uncomfortable, and their quarters often cramped and unsanitary. Your romanticized notions of military life, perhaps gleaned from films, would quickly dissipate in the dusty, isolated reality of a frontier fort. The relationship between the army and the civilian population could also be strained. Soldiers might be seen as saviors, but also as unruly outsiders who caused trouble in towns, consumed scarce resources, and often disregarded local laws. The concept of military justice meant that soldiers were often tried and punished by their own commanders, rather than civilian courts, leading to resentment among the populace. The presence of the army on the frontier was a constant reminder of the raw power dynamic at play, where federal authority, backed by force, was slowly, often violently, imposing order on a vast and untamed land. Having acknowledged the forceful presence of the army on the frontier, your modern outlook, often defined by secularism or a wide array of spiritual choices, would then encounter the profound, often central role of religious life. Forget your casual Sunday services, your diverse denominations, or your freedom to choose no faith at all. In the Wild West, faith was often a vital anchor, providing moral guidance, community cohesion, and desperate hope in an otherwise chaotic and unforgiving existence. Imagine stepping into a makeshift church, perhaps a tent, a sod house, or the back room of a saloon cleared for the purpose. The congregation is a motley collection of weary settlers, rough miners, and grizzled cowboys, all seeking solace and spiritual sustenance. Your expectation of stained glass windows and cushioned pews is replaced by crude benches and the earnest, often booming, voice of a circuit rider or local preacher. This wasn't about architectural grandeur, it was about the raw, visceral need for connection to something larger than oneself in a world that constantly threatened to break your spirit. For many, religion provided a crucial moral compass in a lawless land. The Ten Commandments and biblical teachings offered a framework for behavior when formal laws were absent or weakly enforced. It offered a sense of right and wrong, a promise of divine justice in a world where earthly justice was often fleeting and brutal. Your nuanced moral philosophy, perhaps debating ethical dilemmas, would be simplified to fundamental principles of good and evil. A mainstream historical fact: circuit riders, itinerant preachers who traveled vast distances to bring religious services to isolated frontier communities, were incredibly influential figures, providing not just spiritual guidance but also news and a sense of connection to the outside world. A quirky tidbit: some desperate preachers, unable to find suitable church venues, would deliver sermons from atop overturned wagons, tree stumps, or even flat rocks, turning any available spot into a sacred space. Imagine hearing a sermon delivered from a wobbly, upside-down wagon. Historians still argue whether the strong religious convictions on the frontier primarily fostered community resilience and mutual aid, or if they sometimes contributed to rigid social conservatism and intolerance towards differing beliefs. Beyond moral guidance, religious gatherings provided a vital sense of community and social cohesion. In isolated settlements, the weekly service was often the only opportunity for people to gather, share news, sing hymns, and find comfort in shared fellowship. It was a reprieve from the relentless toil and loneliness, a chance to feel part of something larger than just your individual struggle for survival. Your modern tendency towards individualistic pursuits and online communities would be replaced by a deep reliance on physical proximity and shared faith. Revivals and camp meetings were powerful events, drawing people from miles around, offering emotional release, spiritual fervor, and a rare opportunity for large-scale social interaction. These were not quiet, contemplative services, they were often passionate, theatrical affairs, designed to stir souls and reaffirm faith. your expectation of a calm. Intellectual discourse on spirituality would be challenged by the raw emotionalism and fervent belief. In a world defined by hardship and death, the promise of an afterlife and divine salvation offered a profound comfort. A hope that transcended the daily struggle. The quiet hum of your modern contemplation would be replaced by the impassioned hymns and fervent prayers of a frontier congregation, clinging to faith as their ultimate anchor. With the profound importance of religious life as a community anchor established, your modern craving for constant stimulation and diverse experiences would then encounter the stark simplicity of frontier art and entertainment. Forget your streaming services, your concert venues, your art galleries, or your endless array of digital distractions. In the Wild West, leisure activities were basic, often communal, and deeply interwoven with the fabric of daily life, offering simple pleasures and vital moments of shared humanity. Imagine a long, arduous day coming to an end. Your modern routine might involve unwinding with a movie, scrolling through social media, or playing a video game. In the Old West, entertainment often revolved around storytelling, around a flickering campfire, or in a dimly lit cabin. Someone with a knack for narrative might spin tales of adventure, tall tales, or recounting news from distant places. This wasn't about special effects, it was about the power of the spoken word, capturing imaginations, and momentarily escaping the harsh realities. Your appreciation for compelling narratives, often digitally delivered, would be refocused on raw, oral tradition. Music was another vital form of entertainment, though instrumentation was limited. A worn banjo, a fiddle, or a harmonica might provide the soundtrack to an evening. Songs told stories of love, loss, hard work, and adventure. People sang together, simple tunes that resonated with shared experiences. There were no elaborate sound systems, no auto-tune, just raw, honest voices and basic melodies. Your love for diverse musical genres would be narrowed to a few essential, heartfelt expressions, a mainstream historical fact. Square dances and social gatherings where music and dancing were central were incredibly important for community building and courtship in frontier settlements, offering one of the few opportunities for men and women to socialize formally. A quirky tidbit, some desperate towns, lacking any formal entertainment, would sometimes organize competitive events like spitting contests, beard-growing competitions, or even ugly dog contests, just to create some excitement and a sense of shared amusement. Imagine the thrill of a champion tobacco spitter. Historians still argue whether the simplicity of frontier entertainment fostered a deeper sense of community connection, or if it merely highlighted the profound lack of diverse leisure options beyond organized gatherings. Individual pastimes were also simple. Reading, for those who were literate and had access to a book or newspaper, was a cherished luxury. Carving, whittling, mending, or simply gazing at the vast, starry sky could be moments of quiet contemplation. Your need for constant external engagement would be replaced by an ability to find solace and amusement in the mundane, or in the vastness of nature. Even public entertainment, such as traveling circuses or medicine shows, were rare, highly anticipated events. These were not the sophisticated productions of today. They were often crude, itinerant performances, but they offered a vital break from the daily grind, a flash of color and spectacle in an otherwise monotonous existence. Your sophisticated palate for entertainment would be reset to appreciate the raw energy and simple wonder of these rare spectacles. The constant hum of your various devices, offering endless entertainment options, would be replaced by the quiet sounds of crickets, the crackle of a fire, and the occasional shared laughter or song of your fellow frontiersmen, underscoring the preciousness of human connection in an isolated world. With the simple yet profound forms of frontier entertainment in mind, your modern sensitivities, which prioritize dignified farewells and complex grieving processes, would be brutally confronted by the harsh reality of death and burial. Forget elaborate funerals, carefully chosen caskets, or serene cemeteries with manicured lawns. In the Wild West, life was cheap, death was common, and burials were often hasty, unceremonious affairs, far removed from the comforts and rituals of modern mourning. Imagine someone in your small community succumbs to disease, an accident, or violence. Today, you'd expect a formal funeral home, professional embalming, and a period of grieving surrounded by support networks. In the Old West, death was an ever-present spectre, and the immediate priority was often simply to dispose of the body before disease spread or wild animals became a problem. Your sensitivity to the proper handling of the deceased would be profoundly challenged by the raw expediency of frontier burials. The dead were often buried quickly, sometimes within hours of passing, particularly in remote areas or during epidemics. There were no funeral directors, no specialized embalmers. The body might be simply wrapped in a blanket or a piece of canvas. If a proper coffin couldn't be fashioned from scavenged wood, the grave might be a shallow hole dug by a few weary hands, often unmarked, or marked only by a simple wooden cross or a pile of stones that would soon be lost to the elements. Your expectation of a permanent, identifiable resting place for the deceased would be shattered. A mainstream historical fact, unmarked graves were incredibly common on the frontier, especially for those who died on wagon trails or in isolated prospecting camps, leading to countless lost histories and forgotten souls. A quirky tidbit: some desperate individuals, unable to find wood for a coffin, would improvise using old packing crates or even line a grave with rocks, making the best of what little they had. Imagine burying a loved one in a discarded cracker barrel. Historians still argue whether the high frequency of death on the frontier fostered a deeper acceptance of mortality, or if it simply led to a more hardened, perhaps emotionally numb, populace. The grieving process, too, was often truncated. There was little time for extended mourning when the demands of survival were so pressing. The living had to continue their endless work, clearing land, tending livestock, securing food. Grief was a luxury many could not afford, or one that had to be quickly compartmentalized to endure. Your modern understanding of bereavement counseling and support groups would be utterly absent. The community might offer a few shared words, a quick prayer, and then life, in its brutal indifference, would move on. The very landscape itself became a vast, unofficial cemetery, littered with the graves of those who didn't make it, from disease, from accidents, from violence, from sheer hardship. You'd encounter them on trails, by rivers, or in lonely clearings, constant reminders of the pervasive fragility of life. The silence and starkness of these makeshift burial sites, often blending seamlessly back into the wilderness, would be a chilling testament to the unforgiving nature of the Wild West, where even in death, comfort and recognition were rare privileges. Having contemplated the stark realities of death and burial on the frontier, your modern mind, so accustomed to the steady hum of commerce and industry, would then turn to one of the most fervent and transformative forces in the Wild West, the gold rush. Forget your calm, calculated investments or your leisurely pursuit of hobbies. This was a feverish, all-consuming pursuit of riches that drew masses, promising instant wealth but often delivering only squalor, disease, and shattered dreams. Imagine hearing the whisper, then the roar, of gold. Your everyday life, with its predictable routines and modest aspirations, would be instantly swept away by an overwhelming, almost irrational, urge to drop everything and head for the diggings. This wasn't just news, it was a siren song, a promise of escaping hardship, of instant fortune, of a new life free from the relentless grind. Your rational brain, assessing risk versus reward, would be overridden by the intoxicating allure of easy wealth. The journey to the gold fields itself was a trial by fire. Thousands, then tens of thousands, descended on remote regions, creating instant, chaotic boomtowns that sprang up overnight. These weren't planned communities, they were agglomerations of tents, shacks, and desperate humanity, all focused on one thing: striking it rich. Your expectation of orderly progression, of infrastructure preceding settlement, would be utterly inverted. You'd be living in crowded, unsanitary conditions, surrounded by a desperate, often ruthless, throng of fellow fortune-seekers. A mainstream historical fact, the California gold rush of 1849 famously drew hundreds of thousands from around the world, creating unprecedented population shifts and economic upheaval, but only a tiny fraction ever found significant gold. A quirky tidbit, some gold prospectors became so obsessed that they would reportedly eat their food directly off their gold pans, even sleeping with them, believing it would somehow attract more gold to them. Imagine the sheer, irrational fervor. Historians still argue whether the gold rushes primarily fueled legitimate economic growth and national development, or if they were largely speculative bubbles that led to widespread individual ruin and environmental devastation. The work itself, as we touched on earlier, was brutal. Hours spent stooped in icy streams, panning for specks of gold, or digging dangerous, unstable shafts. The dream of a massive nugget fueled the endless toil, but the reality was often just enough to buy the next meager meal or a swig of cheap whiskey. The physical exhaustion would be constant, and the mental toll of perpetual disappointment would be immense. Your concept of a hard day's work would be redefined by the endless, repetitive, and often unrewarding labor of a miner. Life in the mining camps was a constant gamble, not just in the saloons, but in every aspect of existence. Prices for goods were exorbitant, sanitation was virtually non-existent, and violence was commonplace. Disease spread rapidly through the crowded camps, claiming lives as quickly as fortunes were made or lost. The psychological pressure of seeing others strike it rich, while you found nothing, could drive people to despair, madness, or desperate acts. The gold rush wasn't just an economic phenomenon, it was a societal fever, a mass hallucination of prosperity that consumed countless lives, leaving a landscape scarred by both hope and profound disillusionment. Escaping the feverish, often futile, pursuit of gold, your focus would shift to another iconic, equally grueling aspect of the Wild West, the cattle drives. Forget your air-conditioned offices, your predictable schedules, or your comfortable commute. This was a life of relentless toil, danger, and immense physical endurance, spent in the saddle, driving thousands of head of cattle across vast, untamed distances. Imagine yourself as a cowboy, your romanticized notions of riding freely across the plains, singing songs around a campfire, would quickly be replaced by the sheer monotony and danger of the job. You'd spend weeks, sometimes months, in the saddle, from sunup to sundown, covered in dust and sweat, breathing the scent of cattle and horseflesh. Your legs would ache, your back would be stiff, and the constant rocking motion of the horse would become an inescapable part of your existence. This wasn't a leisurely ride, it was a non-stop, high-stakes operation. The primary goal was to move large herds of cattle from the ranches of Texas and other southern states to distant railheads in Kansas or other northern markets. This journey, often covering hundreds of miles, was fraught with peril. Rivers had to be crossed, often dangerous affairs where cattle could drown or scatter. Stampedes, triggered by a sudden noise, a lightning strike, or even just a nervous steer, were a constant, terrifying threat. Imagine the ground trembling beneath you as thousands of panicked animals thunder past, threatening to crush everything in their path. Your survival depended on your horse's agility and your ability to maintain control in chaos. A mainstream historical fact, the post-Civil War era saw the rise of massive cattle drives, driven by the demand for beef in the eastern US and the development of railroads. Iconic trails like the Chisholm Trail saw millions of cattle moved north. A quirky tidbit, some cowboys would develop unique lullabies or low, soothing calls for the cattle, believing that singing to them at night would keep them calm and prevent stampedes. Imagine trying to soothe a 1,000-pound animal to sleep with a gravelly rendition of Home on the Range. Historians still argue whether the romantic image of the cowboy as a free-spirited adventurer accurately reflects the often mundane and arduous reality of the cattle drive. Beyond stampedes, there were other threats. Rustlers, as we've discussed, were always on the prowl, looking to cut off a few head of cattle under the cover of darkness. Native American tribes, whose lands were being encroached upon, sometimes demanded tolls or engaged in skirmishes. The weather, as always, was an unpredictable enemy, bringing sudden blizzards, scorching heat, or torrential rains that turned trails into impassable mud. Your diet would be monotonous and unappetizing: beans, coffee, hardtack, and tough beef from the herd. Sleep would be short and restless, often on the open ground with only a saddle for a pillow, always with one ear open for the sounds of the herd or approaching danger. There were no showers, no fresh clothes, just the accumulating grime of weeks on the trail. The cowboy's life was one of relentless exposure and physical demand, forging a unique breed of resilience but also extracting a heavy toll on body and spirit. Your current definition of a tough job would pale in comparison to the sheer, grinding reality of a frontier cattle drive. Having envisioned the relentless grind of a cattle drive, your modern experience of swift, comfortable intercontinental travel would then confront the monumental, often heartbreaking, reality of wagon trains. Forget your cruises, your luxury trains, or your comfortable car rides. Crossing the continent by wagon was an epic undertaking, a perilous path west fraught with unimaginable danger, rampant disease, and the constant spectre of starvation. Imagine yourself packed into a creaking, thorn, dust-covered prairie schooner, not for a weekend camping trip, but for a journey that could last 5 to 6 months, covering over 2,000 miles. Your vehicle has no suspension, no climate control, and minimal comfort. Every bump, every rut, every rock would send a jarring shock through your body. The interior, cramped with your entire life's possessions, would be stifling hot during the day and bitterly cold at night. Your sense of personal space and ease of movement would be completely violated. The sheer scale of the undertaking was immense. Thousands of individuals, often entire families, grouped together for safety in wagon trains, hoping there was strength in numbers. But even within the group, hardships were personal and relentless. You would walk most of the day, alongside the slow-moving oxen or mules, saving your strength and the wagon's capacity. Your feet, as you remember, would be perpetually sore, blistered, and caked in dust. A mainstream historical fact, the Oregon Trail, California Trail, and Mormon Trail were the primary routes for westward migration, and collectively, hundreds of thousands of pioneers traveled these paths, facing incredible challenges. A quirky tidbit: some desperate pioneers, unable to haul all their possessions, would literally abandon cherished family heirlooms, pianos, or heavy furniture along the trail, creating makeshift graveyards of discarded dreams, simply to lighten the load for their oxen. Imagine leaving behind everything you own just to keep moving forward. Historians still argue whether the extreme cooperative spirit fostered within wagon trains was a greater testament to human resilience, or if the constant pressure and proximity often led to increased internal conflicts and despair. Disease was the silent killer of the trails, as we've already seen. Cholera, dysentery, measles, and influenza swept through wagon trains, claiming lives with horrifying speed. Graves, often unmarked, dotted the trails every few miles. Accidents were also tragically common: drownings during treacherous river crossings, accidental gunshots, or being run over by wagon wheels. Your modern expectation of emergency services or rapid medical intervention would be a cruel fantasy. Water and food were constant concerns. Rivers could be swollen and impassable, leading to agonizing delays. Game could be scarce, and reliance on dwindling provisions was a daily anxiety. Your diet would be monotonous, and starvation was a very real threat if supplies ran low or were lost. The psychological toll of the journey was perhaps the heaviest burden. Weeks turned into months. Each day an endless repetition of dust, toil, and fear. The vast, empty landscape could induce feelings of profound loneliness and insignificance. The promises of a new life out west, so compelling at the outset, were tested by the brutal, unrelenting realities of the trail, leaving many broken or buried along the perilous path, having just endured the grueling, agonizingly slow passage of a wagon train. Your modern craving for efficiency and speed would then focus on what was meant to be the future of frontier travel, the railroads. Forget your high-speed commuter trains, your plush seating, or your dining cars. While symbolizing immense progress, early rail travel in the Wild West was still uncomfortable, often slow by modern standards, and, surprisingly, susceptible to attacks and the very dangers it was meant to overcome. Imagine stepping onto a train car in the mid-19th century. Your expectation of a smooth, quiet journey is immediately dashed by the jarring rumble, the constant swaying, and the pervasive smell of coal smoke, hot metal, and unwashed passengers. The seats would be hard, often wooden benches, offering little comfort for journeys that could still last days. There was no air conditioning, no heating beyond a rudimentary stove, and certainly no pristine restrooms. Your modern concept of a comfortable journey would be profoundly disrupted. Early trains were noisy, dirty, and prone to breakdowns. Sparks from the smokestack could ignite fires along the track or even set passenger clothing alight. The constant soot and grime would cover everything, including you, leaving you perpetually smudged and uncomfortable. Your understanding of clean, efficient public transport would be completely challenged by the raw, industrial reality of early rail. A mainstream historical fact, the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad in 1869 dramatically reduced travel time across the continent from months to about a week, fundamentally transforming westward expansion and commerce. This was a monumental engineering feat, but travel on it was still far from luxurious. A quirky tidbit, some early rail passengers would bring their own food and water for long journeys, as dining cars were non-existent, and stops for provisions were often infrequent and unreliable, leaving you at the mercy of whatever meager fare might be available at a tiny station. Imagine packing enough rations for a week-long train ride. Historians still argue whether the railroad's impact on Native American displacement was primarily an unintended consequence of progress, or a deliberate tool of conquest to open up their lands to settlement. Despite their speed advantage over wagons, trains were not immune to the dangers of the frontier. Train robberies by outlaws became an iconic form of banditry, where masked men would force trains to stop, blowing open safes and looting passengers. Your sense of security, relying on enclosed spaces and modern security, would be shattered by the raw vulnerability of a train being held up in the middle of nowhere. There were no armed guards on every car, and communication to summon help was almost impossible. Even construction of the railroads was incredibly perilous, relying on vast numbers of laborers, including Chinese immigrants and Irish immigrants, who worked in brutal conditions, facing accidents, disease, and sometimes violent confrontations. The iron horse may have tamed the land, but it did so at an immense human cost. Your appreciation for the infrastructure you take for granted would deepen as you witness the sheer effort involved in laying every mile of track across mountains, deserts, and vast plains. The distant whistle of a modern train, a soothing sound in your world, would here be a constant reminder of progress pushing relentlessly, and often brutally, into the untamed wilderness, shifting from the iron horse to an even more desperate attempt at rapid communication. Your modern reliance on instant digital messaging would then encounter the legendary, yet short-lived, reality of the Pony Express. Forget your fiber optic cables and satellites. This was a daring, almost suicidal, mail service that highlighted the incredible challenges of connecting vast distances in the Wild West. Imagine needing to send a vital message, perhaps a government dispatch or an urgent business letter, across 2,000 miles. Today, it's a click of a button. In the mid-19th century, before the telegraph fully spanned the continent, the Pony Express offered the fastest solution, a relay of brave riders on horseback, pushing themselves and their animals to the absolute limit. Your expectation of reliable, instant communication would be replaced by a profound awe, mixed with terrifying anxiety. For the sheer audacity of this endeavor, the Pony Express operated by having a series of relay stations, typically 10 to 15 miles apart. A rider would gallop from one station to the next, quickly changing to a fresh horse, and then continue at breakneck speed. After several runs, he would hand off his mail pouch to another rider, who would continue the journey. This system allowed for astonishing speeds for the era. Mail could travel from St. Joseph, Missouri, to Sacramento, California, in about 10 days. A fraction of the time it took by stagecoach or wagon train. Your concept of fast delivery would be utterly redefined by this human-powered relay race. A mainstream historical fact, the Pony Express only operated for about 18 months, from April 1860 to October 1861, before being made obsolete by the completion of the transcontinental telegraph line. Despite its short lifespan, It captured the American imagination and became an enduring symbol of frontier daring. A quirky tidbit: Pony Express riders were usually small, lightweight men, often teenagers, and they took an oath not to curse, drink, or fight with other riders or station keepers, which was probably easier said than done in the rough frontier environment. Imagine entrusting your most vital communications to a swearing, drinking, fighting teenager. Historians still argue whether the romantic image of the Pony Express overshadows the brutal treatment of the horses, who were often ridden to exhaustion and breakdown in the service of speed. The life of a Pony Express rider was one of extreme danger and isolation. They faced treacherous weather conditions, blizzards, scorching deserts, torrential rains. They rode through territories often hostile, risking attacks from Native American tribes or outlaws. Accidents, from falls to animal injuries, were common. Your daily commute, perhaps an annoying traffic jam, would be a pristine paradise compared to the constant life-or-death gamble of a Pony Express ride. Each rider carried very little besides their mail pouch, a canteen, and perhaps a pistol. They relied entirely on the isolated stations for fresh horses and minimal supplies. Loneliness was a constant companion, broken only by the brief exchanges at the relay points. The Pony Express was a desperate, almost romantic, sprint against time and distance, a testament to human ingenuity and courage, but also a stark reminder of how disconnected the world truly was before the advent of truly modern communication. The thunder of hooves, carrying precious messages across an untamed continent, would be a sound of both progress and profound isolation. From the fleeting, desperate dash of the Pony Express, your attention would finally turn to the true harbinger of modern connectivity, a technology that began to genuinely shrink the vast distances of the Wild West, the telegraph. Forget your lightning-fast internet connections and wireless communication. While far from instantaneous by today's standards, the telegraph was a revolutionary leap forward, a glimmer of true modern connectivity in an otherwise isolated world. Imagine needing to send a message across hundreds, or even thousands, of miles, after the months it took for a letter, or the mere days for the Pony Express. The concept of a message traveling almost instantaneously, conveyed by electrical impulses along a wire, was nothing short of miraculous. Your reliance on the digital world means you take this speed for granted, but to a frontiersman, it was akin to magic, a direct link to a world previously beyond reach. The telegraph operated by sending coded electrical signals, Morse code, over wires strung across poles. A telegraph operator at one end would tap out a message, and another operator at the receiving end would transcribe the clicks into words. This meant that while the transmission itself was fast, the process still required human intervention and interpretation, making it a far cry from your current instant messaging. There was no direct typing to your recipient. A mainstream historical fact, the transcontinental telegraph line was completed in October 1861. Immediately rendering the Pony Express obsolete. Its construction was a monumental feat of engineering, stretching across deserts, mountains, and plains, often preceding the railroads. A quirky tidbit: some desperate or curious frontier residents would sometimes try to listen in on telegraph lines by pressing their ears against the poles, hoping to catch snippets of news, though, of course, they would only hear the clicks and buzzes, not the decoded message. Imagine trying to get your news update by hugging a wooden pole. Historians still argue whether the telegraph's rapid spread primarily aided in the taming of the West by facilitating communication for military and commercial interests, or if it simply accelerated the displacement of Native American populations and the exploitation of resources. The telegraph had an immediate and profound impact. Business decisions could be made more quickly. As news of market prices or available goods traveled rapidly, news from the East, or even from Europe, could arrive in a matter of hours, albeit, in short, terse messages. Military commanders could coordinate troop movements more effectively. Your modern ability to make real-time decisions, based on up-to-the-minute information, has its roots in this groundbreaking technology. However, the telegraph was still vulnerable. Wires could be cut by saboteurs, knocked down by storms, or damaged by animals. Maintaining the lines across such vast distances was a constant challenge, requiring repair crews to brave the same dangers as anyone else on the frontier. And while the message traveled fast, getting it to the nearest telegraph office or from the receiving office to its final destination, could still involve long, dangerous journeys by horse or wagon. So, while it was a glimmer of the future, it wasn't the seamless, ubiquitous connectivity you experience today. The faint, rhythmic clicks of the telegraph key, however, were the first true pulse of a connected world beating across the vast silence of the American West. As the telegraph lines slowly stitched the continent together, your modern understanding of an ever-expanding, interconnected world would witness the gradual, yet inevitable, process of the end of the frontier. Forget the endless, wild expanse portrayed in dime novels. As settlements grew, railroads stretched, and communication improved, the Wild West, as a concept, as a truly untamed, ungoverned wilderness, gradually faded, leaving behind its legends and a drastically altered landscape. Imagine watching the open range, once boundless and free, slowly being crisscrossed by barbed wire fences. Your appreciation for untouched nature, for vast, pristine wilderness, would give way to the sight of settled farms, bustling towns, and the increasing signs of human encroachment. This wasn't a sudden event, but a slow, grinding process, mile by mile, settlement by settlement. The very wildness that defined the frontier was being systematically tamed, or perhaps simply absorbed. The official declaration of the closing of the frontier by the U.S. Census Bureau in 1890, while a statistical designation, marked a symbolic turning point. It meant that there was no longer a discernible line beyond which the population density dropped significantly to suggest an unsettled wilderness. This wasn't about a literal wall being built. It was about the continuous spread of American settlement and the establishment of institutions that mirrored the East. Your concept of a constantly available new frontier for exploration and escape would be replaced by the reality of a land largely carved up and claimed. A mainstream historical fact: the influx of settlers, the expansion of railroads, and the development of ranching and farming systematically diminished the open range and led to the decline of traditional Native American ways of life, effectively closing the frontier by transforming the land. A quirky tidbit: some desperate frontiersmen, clinging to the romantic ideal of the untamed West, would continue to move further and further west, seeking out the last truly wild corners, only to find that civilization was often just a few years behind them. Imagine always chasing an elusive, vanishing dream. Historians still argue whether the closing of the frontier led primarily to the positive development of a unified nation, or if it represented the tragic loss of a unique way of life and the systematic destruction of indigenous cultures and ecosystems. The iconic figures of the Wild West, the independent trapper, the solitary prospector, the nomadic cowboy, the free-ranging Native American warrior, found their way of life increasingly constrained and eventually, largely ended. Their skills, once essential for survival in the wilderness, became less relevant in a world of settled farms, established towns, and burgeoning industries. Your appreciation for specialized, old-world skills might feel a twinge of nostalgia for these vanishing professions. The rise of towns and cities, with their increasing populations, brought more formal law enforcement, better communication, and a more structured social order. The raw lawlessness slowly receded, replaced by courthouses, schools, and churches. The rugged individualism that defined early frontier life began to give way to a more communal, interdependent society. Your preference for self-reliance and personal freedom would face the inevitable compromises of living in a more organized, regulated world. The Wild West, as a geographical and cultural entity, didn't disappear overnight, but its final, dwindling embers faded under the relentless march of progress, transforming a land of dangerous opportunity into a nation built on its memory. And so, as the telegraph lines hummed and fences stretched across the plains, the physical frontier may have closed, but its spirit, its legacy and myth, continued to captivate us. Forget your carefully curated historical documentaries and academic analyses. The romanticized image of the Wild West, a land of rugged individualism, daring heroes, and dramatic showdowns, continues to capture our imaginations, despite its often harsh and brutal reality. Imagine yourself today, flipping through channels or browse online, and inevitably you'll stumble upon a western. You see the lone cowboy, the heroic sheriff, the saloon gunfight, the vast, untouched landscapes. This is the myth. A powerful narrative forged from the dramatic events and compelling figures of the era. Your fascination with adventure, with stories of good versus evil, finds a potent expression in this enduring imagery. This romanticization isn't accidental. It's a deliberate construction that began even as the frontier was closing, fueled by dime novels, Wild West shows like Buffalo Bills, and later, by Hollywood films and television. These narratives often distilled complex realities into simpler, more dramatic tales, creating archetypes that resonate with universal themes: freedom, courage, justice, and the struggle against the wild. Your innate desire for thrilling stories finds fertile ground in these exaggerated portrayals. A mainstream historical fact, figures like Buffalo Bill Cody, an actual plainsman and scout, capitalized on the public's fascination with the disappearing frontier by creating elaborate Wild West shows that toured nationally and internationally, featuring staged gunfights, reenactments of buffalo hunts, and appearances by real Native Americans. A quirky tidbit, some of the most enduring Western tropes, like the showdown at high noon or the good guy in a white hat, were largely inventions of fiction writers and early filmmakers, rather than common occurrences in real frontier life. Imagine that iconic image of two men walking towards each other on a dusty street. A scene that probably happened far less often than you think. Historians still argue whether the romanticized myth of the Wild West has obscured the true, often painful, history of the period, or if it serves as a valuable cultural touchstone that reflects enduring American ideals. The legacy of the Wild West is multifaceted. It cemented ideas of American exceptionalism, self-reliance, and opportunity. It contributed to the unique identity of the United States as a nation forged in struggle and expansion. Your own cultural understanding, even if you're not American, likely carries echoes of these frontier narratives. The very concept of moving west or striking out on your own still holds a powerful, almost spiritual allure. But beneath the myth lies the often unacknowledged reality we've explored: the brutal hardships, the rampant disease, the lawlessness, the environmental toll, and the tragic displacement of Native American populations. The Wild West was a land of immense suffering and profound injustice. Alongside the undeniable courage and ingenuity, your critical thinking, developed in a world that encourages deeper historical analysis, allows you to peel back the layers of romanticism and see the full, complex picture. So, as we bring our journey to a close, remember the grit, the grime, the hunger, the fear, and the sheer, brutal effort it took just to survive a day in that untamed world. The Wild West may live on in our stories and our dreams, a powerful symbol of a time when the rules were written in dust and blood. But if you were really there, tonight, right now, with all your modern comforts stripped away, well, you probably wouldn't have survived a day. This journey through the Wild West is now fading, like distant campfire embers against a vast, dark sky. The sounds of creaking wagons, distant coyote howls, and the faint strum of a lonely banjo are softening, blending into the quiet around you. Feel the last vestiges of dust settling, and the phantom ache of weary muscles slowly dissolving. The stories of hardship and grit are receding, replaced by a gentle calm. Allow your mind to release the grip of history, letting the details blur into a comforting haze. There's no more struggle, no more fear, just the quiet of the present moment enveloping you. Drift now, letting the echoes of the frontier lull you into a deep, peaceful slumber. Sweet dreams. End of script. End of script. Sweet dreams.